And welcome back. We're doing another Storytime Sunday. But happened to catch something interesting. So this article came up in my feed. Strange anomalies in Westfall spotted on the war within beta. Okay. Sounds interesting. It says players have spotted some strange anomalies in Westfall in the war within beta. What could they mean? It shows Westfall landscape with an anomaly in the ground characterized by jagged, spike-like formations emerging from the earth. The spikes are sharp and irregular, surrounded by a central area filled with appears to be molten lava. But ages, these formations keep moving and appearing in different spots. Nowhere to be seen on live servers. Here's a close-up of that. So I'm like, okay, we've seen these before, and it's usually done by rock elementals. So any earth elemental will probably be doing this. Right? But the gold parts, that's not lava. Those are cracks. And it's shining yellow through it. Yellow through it usually means Azeroth herself. So there may not also be just a war with the Void Lords. She might be having a war with elementals too. Which could be really interesting. I don't think this is meaning that the world's gonna crack in two. That's supposed to happen. Like I said, the reason why Argus was cracked apart was because of Illidan forcing it to move. I don't know how many light years. So that it hung over Azeroth instead, so he could use that as a base. So, totally different. So, now I'm just wondering if she's having a fight with the, well, yeah, it's the same photo. It's okay. A fight with the elementals too, which is very possible. So one of spikes outside of Ogrimmar. Surrounded by pierced both of lava. What are you? Y'all stupid. Like, yeah, you're not following anything. I could tell. It's cool. It's cool. All right. I just thought I'd show that off. That was kind of interesting. All right. I might check that out myself tomorrow. Anywho, continuing on. On the aspects. Remember last time Kalik actually witnessed the disbanding of the Warm Rust Council. And every dragon acting pouty because they don't have their special abilities anymore. I remind you, these are the exact same dragons that had fissy fits about, the night elves trying to reclaim their immortality. And now these dragons do not have their immortality anymore. So of course they're losing their ever loving minds now. Actually, they're just being kind of pissy about it. So I would have music playing in the background, but it seems like even though I'm using a service that's supposed to have um, music that isn't claimable, or at least they're free to use, even though I'm paying for a service, somebody's still claiming them. So I'm just gonna not bother with that right now. Okay. So let me know if oh, shoot. Really? All right. I guess we can do that. I'd rather not. Let's see. This screen. I know some of the words are still kind of blocked, but let me know if you want me to move that or anything. No matter what I do, it's gonna look bad. Yeah, it looks really bad. All right. I need to figure out a better screen for this. I block it. Text blocks it. Everything blocks it. Okay. That should work. All right. So he's witnessing the disbanding of the Wormrust Accord. Um, he goes back. Then he finds something glinting within Galakron's bones. Turns out to be a Titan artifact, and what it's doing is it's playing back memories of the aspects, before they were even dragons. And he's getting lost in the visions. All right, let's continue on. Kalik? Kalik! Her voice was the first thing to pierce the darkness, and it drew him back to waking. He mumbled what should have been her name, although even to his ears the sounds made no sense. The former aspect opened his eyes, expecting both to be still lying in the tunnel and to have her leaning over him. Which of those would shame him more, he could not say. But when he peered around, it was to find himself alone, and no longer lying in the passage. Somehow, he had come to be transported to the gigantic cavern that was his sanctum. More perplexing, he even lay in his favorite sleeping spot. But the question of how Kalik had gotten here was a minor one to the Blue. What was more important was what had happened after he had blackened out. How long had he been lost within, Kalik did not know. But he did have a very good idea as to the source of the startling visions. Uncurling stiff digits, the dragon beheld the seemingly insignificant artifact. A curse escaped him as the sight of it, and he almost threw it against one of the cavern walls. Thinking better of it, the dragon instead turned toward a shadowy part of his sanctum. Kalik drew forth a bit of that shadow. From within there emerged a large cubic shape that expanded before his eyes, growing immensely enough to contain a night elf. Had Kalik desired it larger, he could have expanded it with only a thought. The arcane prisons had been created for a variety of tasks, including what the second half of their name indicated. But this was one of many secreted in Nexus, and Kalik had chosen it because it was emptier than most. Blue energy crackling all around it, the massive cube floated slightly above the ground. To an onlooker, it resembled a large box seemingly made of wood and stone, and lined at each edge by a bronze metallic border. Rich blue seals ran across the center of each of the four sides from the top to the bottom, and a dark border ran across the middle, as if the top and bottom were separate halves, kept together only by the seals and border. At the former aspect's unspoken command, the seals fell away and the metallic border faded. Now acting like a lid, the upper half tipped open. Not all cane prisons functioned in this manner. This one, being designed specifically for storage, could also open in several other ways, depending on what Kalik needed of it. Thrusting his paw inside, the dragon deposited the artifact. There, it not only would be safe from other eyes, but would no longer be able to taint his thoughts. Resealing, the arcane prison vanished again. Exhaling in relief, Kalik recalled the voice that had brought him back from the darkness. This was not the first time that she had reached out to him since his departure from Dalaran. After their last meeting, she had no doubt assumed that he would contact her again, but he had found so many reasons not to, including his certainty that even she blamed him in part for not finding the iris. They could not continue this charade, Kalik decided, not for the first time. There was no path ahead that the two of them could travel together. And yet, once again, her voice touched him. Kalik, Kalik, speak to me. He wanted to ignore her, but his will had been too weakened by the visions. Besides, Kalik told himself, as an archmage, perhaps the greatest one, not with the blood of a dragon coursing through her veins, she might know something of the magic that would create a thing like what he had found. Jaina was, after all, the one who had helped him sense the focusing iris when his own efforts had failed. From that hunt alone, he considered her in many ways far more cunning, more adaptable than he, and that made him all the more shamed of by his own failures. When she called him again, Kalik finally answered, "I am here, Jaina." As he replied, two things also happened. The least of those was a gap that opened in the air before him, a gap in the center of which formed a large circular image of a walled chamber he knew was hundreds of miles away. In that image, a feminine figure began to take shape. But even before that took place, Kalik himself went through a transformation. He shrank, becoming only a fraction of his original size. The dragon stood on his hind legs, which reversed at the knees and became like those of a man, even as the forelegs became matching arms. Kalik's wings and tail shriveled, finally vanishing. His snout retreated into his face, which lost its scale and deep blue tint, at last refining into a pale but handsome young face worthy of any of the elven races. The most obvious hints remained of his true self was his long blue-black hair and the hunter's garments he now wore, which were also of a dark blue and black. Kalik straightened, in many ways more comfortable as he was now than when a dragon. In this form he had learned what it was like to truly live, to truly understand happiness and pain. Indeed, often there were moments when he wished that he had been born as the humanoid creature he pretended to be here. As he finished transforming, the figure of the image also became fully distinct. However, unlike Kalik, the woman before him was exactly what she appeared to be: human, beautiful, so very powerful, and still so young for all she had been forced to experience. Kayla could see how recent events had done even more to harden her, although she tried to pretend that she had not changed. Jaina Prodmore had not asked to become leader of the Council of Six, the Council of Wizards ruling the realm of Dalaran, but she had been the one to whom the other powers had turned after the sacrifice of her predecessor Ronan. Jaina, the daughter of the late legendary, and some would also say infamous, Grand Admiral Dalen Proudmoore, had also had to balance her duties on the council with governing the island kingdom of Theramore. All of that would have been too much for many creatures, dragons included. But in addition, Jaina had had to deal with both her part in her father's death and her failure to save Theramore from eventual destruction at the brutish hands of the Horde. "We are two of a kind," Kalik thought as he beheld her. He kept his expression neutral as she focused on him. In contrast, Jaina smiled gratefully, as if Kalik had granted her a special favor in finally responding. That only made him feel worse. "I was beginning to worry about you." Her voice was rich and melodious, at least to Kalik, but tinged with past pains and regrets. He marveled that she had the wherewithal to continue as she did, despite her grief for all those slain in Theramore, and her remorse over what she had planned to do against Orgrimmar with the stolen focusing iris. Honestly, I wouldn't have blamed her for doing it, but of course, that was also why he both admired and felt a bond with her. I appreciate your concern, Jaina, but I am fine. Are you? She leaned closer, almost seeming able to touch him. Her gaze bored into Kalik, who felt that if the mage could read into what passed for a dragon's soul. You aren't sleeping enough. I can see that. You're driving yourself too much. All this work can wait a little longer. It has to be done, he blurted out too quickly. He was as surprised as she looked by the obvious bitterness that tinged his words. Jaina recovered almost immediately, compassion replacing the surprise. The compassion only made Kalik more abashed. How are you? He asked in a deliberate change of subject. How fares the Kirin Tor? Despite understanding just what he was doing, she allowed the change. We still struggle to keep things together, but we're doing it. You know as well as I do how things have turned upside down since your last visit. I've been forced to make some changes I don't like, but they're necessary. When Jaina did not elaborate on those changes, Kalik did not press. He wanted very much to help her, but what could he, who could do nothing for himself, do for her? Perhaps it is time to end this, the dragon decided. Perhaps we can do nothing for one another. An image of the young Alexstrasza burned through his mind. Kalik could neither suppress a gasp nor keep his body from shivering. Unfortunately, Jaina noted both. Kalik, are you ill? A dragon's roar, or, more likely, a proto-dragon's, drowned out whatever else she said. Still, the blue managed to put on a veneer of strength before the mage. As you said, I've not gotten enough rest. My apologies for frightening you. He tried very hard to sound indifferent, hoping that she would believe all that he was well. Kalik was not certain if his thinking was clear, but he had hoped it was, for other sounds and images were already assailing him. Jaina remained where she was. Her expression was unreadable. Are you sure you're all right? The image of another proto-dragon corpse took his attention. There was something even more unsettling about this one, but the image vanished before Kayla could make sense of just what it was that bothered him. The sounds, especially the voices, grew maddening. Yes, he called too loudly. Forgive me. I have a council to convene. No longer caring if his excuses made sense, Kalik dismissed the vision of the mage. Jaina faded away just as she looked ready to say something. The former aspect stumbled to the center of his sanctum, already reeling from the onslaught of voices and jumbled images. He was grateful that neither Jaina nor any of his dragonfly could see him staggering. Kalik fell to his knees. He managed to plant a hand against the smooth rock floor, a hand partially scaled with long, wicked nails. Unable to focus, Kalik contorted as his body sought some balance between his true form and the humanoid one he had put on for Jaina's sake. His mouth and nose stretched forward, and his legs shrieked with pain as his knees shifted back and forth. It was one thing to simply change from one shape to another, but to keep shifting between them took a toll that he had never suffered before. It was finally too much. Kalik fell forward, and once again soared through the air as some part of the young Malagos. Time had shifted again. Alexstrasza no longer accompanied Malagos, but there were other proto-dragons in the sky. Proto-dragons of at least 6 different colors. Despite their differences, they appeared disinclined to fight one another, although Kalik suspected that could always change. Malagos radiated agitation, which in turn overtook Kalik. What bothered Malagos was not clear to Kalik. The proto-dragon had buried his thoughts deep at this time, even seeming not to want to deal with them himself. Part of the reason for so many different proto-dragons in the same region became obvious as a vast herd of huge beasts. Sorry. Try that line again. Part of the reason for so many different proto-dragons in the same region became obvious as a vast herd of huge beasts, some sort of brown hairy caribou, raced along the low grassy hills below. Two proto-dragons had already dived down and snatched up ready meals, but a smaller yellowish female failed to judge her dive and almost collided to the ground. As she pulled up, she was joined by none other than Alexstrasza, who had just snatched up another of the grazers. Unlike the other hunters, the fire-orange female had quickly bitten through the neck where the animal's great vein was located, killing it instantly. Kayla could sense Malagos's amusement at such a tactic. Most proto-dragons preferred their prey alive and fresh until the last moment. Alexstrasza, though, appeared to almost feel guilty about having to hunt at all. She tried to offer the meal to the smaller female, who clearly needed nourishment, but the yellowish proto-dragon instead snapped angrily at her. Rather than grow furious herself, Alexstrasza continued to patiently attend to her companion. Even now, she takes care of the helpless, Kayla thought without admiration, thinking of Alexstrasza as the aspect of life. Here, so very young, she still revealed far more concern for others than most. Malagos lost interest for the moment in the two females, forcing Calyx's perspective to shift to watching other hunters. The proto-dragon took mild interest in a coarse brown male's technique. The other male would hover over the running herd, then, seemingly prescient, dive toward it just as he made a sharp turn designed to put the winged predator off their mark. Not so the brown male. In fact, he seemed to know at just what angle and what speed the grazers would turn. Where more than one other hunter ended up with mounds of torn dirt and grass, he plucked up two tasty morsels in a rapid succession. Malagos admired the other's cleverness and timing, then lost interest as two of the hunters who had failed to snag their quarry now hissed and spat at one another. No words passed between them. Like the great male Kalik and his host have encountered previously, these proto-dragons were little better than the savage cats or wolves roaming other parts of the world. Malagos watched their angry fight with contempt, while Kalik again wondered why some proto-dragons had progressed towards sentience, while others had not. A few other proto-dragons in the midst of devouring their meals also watched, some with clear intelligence, others like beasts wary that the fighters might try next to steal their food. One blue-green male sneered at the pair, then glared at Malagos when he realized Calyx's host was watching them. Koros. The name came to mind as if Kalik knew the other male himself. Malagos obviously did, and the enmity between them was clear. Koros hissed at his rival, then thrust his muzzle into his fresh kill. The blue-green male ripped free a hefty portion of bloody meat, then chewed it while staring at Malagos as if it had been torn from the latter's throat. Calyx sensed Malagos considering fighting Koros, but the dangerous train of thought was interrupted by the alighting of a small yellowish female next to him. She snorted in frustration as Alexstrasza, still gripping the carcass, landed next to her and across from Calyx's host. "My brother," began the smaller proto-dragon hesitantly. "My sister says you found him." It startled both Malagos and Kalik that this was Alexstrasza's sibling. Their colors were different, though her yellow tint was also not like that of the two other families Kalik knew existed, thanks to Malagos. The only similarity between the females was their smooth, nearly glass-like skin, so different from the typical rough hide of most proto-dragons. "We were 3 in the clutch. 3 to survive. Now, only 2. Malagos dipped his head in understanding. For proto-dragons, the surviving clutch of only 3 eggs meant ill tidings for the family. Indeed, in a many healthy proto-dragon family, a sickly offspring such as the yellow female would have been slain at hatching. She seemed to be waiting for some more elaborate response from Malagos. He finally said, "Your clutch brother. His death was strange." It was certainly not how Kalik would have replied if he were in Malagos's place, but Alexstrasza's sister seemed pleased. "Yes, he died strangely." "How did he die?" "I do not know." The smaller female leaning closer. "There was another—" "No, Ysera," interrupted Alexstrasza sharply. "We agreed that—" Whatever she said next was lost to Kalik, who took advantage of Malagos's view to stare in amazement at yet another of the great aspects. Having known the Ysera of recent times, Ysera the Awakened, he could not imagine how this weaker creature could have become one of the most powerful forces in all Azeroth. Snapping and hissing brought Kalik's attention back to what Malagos was experiencing. Alexstrasza and Ysera, their necks bent back, maneuvered as if seeking to fight one another. Each displayed her sharp teeth and claws to her utmost, even Ysera proving capable of an incredibly menacing showing. Several times both heads darted in, but then pulled back once more. Kalik knew such confrontations from his own kind and could generally recognize what was real and what was simply normal display. But with the sisters it was hard to tell. The jaws of both Ysera and Alexstrasza snapped dangerously close to the other's throat, and the claws scraped against hides more than once. And then a sound louder than thunder stilled not only the sisters, but every proto-dragon in the vicinity. The sound erupted again, shaking the rocky ridges upon which Malagos and many of the other hunters perched. Several of the proto-dragons were cowed, and Kalik felt even Malagos fight not to prostrate himself. Only then did Kalik realize that the incredible noise was a gigantic roar. A vast region of the overcast sky broke away, descending with astonishing swiftness. The velocity caused the clouds to quickly scatter, revealing a sight that truly could daunt not only a proto-dragon, but even the most powerful of Kalik's own kind. This was supposed to be a proto-dragon, but so immense was its size that not even a dragon could be chosen for an adequate comparison. Kalik could think of no creature save one that could be used, and that would have meant comparing Galakrond to himself. Even though Kalik had never seen the gigantic Galakrond in the flesh, the remote possibility that he would not have recognized this titanic being had been eliminated by Galakrond's name racing over and over through Malagos's mind. In addition, though his host's brief glimpse away from the father of dragons to the other proto-dragons, Kalik saw that not one of the hunters remained in the sky. Galakrond now commanded the world above, and there was no proto-dragon foolish enough to challenge that rule. He swooped down, passing over the entire region in a matter of seconds. In Galakrond's wake there came a vicious wind that even tore several proto-dragons from their roosts and sent more than one meal toppling to the ground far below. Galakrond's roar was no less ground-shaking miles away, forcing Malagos and the sisters to grip their perches tighter. For such a colossal creature, Galakrond turned with remarkable agility. Once more he passed over the now panicking herd, but this time with intent. Galakrond seized up 2 caribou in each of his much larger hindpaws and scooped up another whole in his gargantuan maw, then rose up. The grazer in his mouth vanished down his gullet, and a moment later so did both of those in his left hind paw. By the time Galakrond leveled, all 5 of his catches were well on their way down to his stomach. But 5 was not enough. Galakrond veered back and lunged toward the scattering prey. This time, however, he suddenly pulled back. Confused at first, Kalik watched as the bending of the vast wings during the halt created a windstorm that sent dozens of beasts rolling uncontrollably. But before several of the caribou could rise to their feet, Galakrond plucked them up. With at least Eight claimed that Kalik could see the father of dragons soared back into the clouds. It was not until several seconds after Galakron's departure that the first proto-dragons dared move. There was no renewal of the hunt. Not only were the caribou scattered so far and wide that pursuit would have required too much effort, but most of the proto-dragons were still too shaken up by Galakron's startling manifestation. Some took to the skies themselves and fled for calmer climes. Others remained subdued. The father of dragons. Kalik could still not believe the stunning image. To witness Galakron alive was something he could never have imagined. The blue little of Galakron, save that he had been one of the largest beings to roam Azeroth, and that he had represented the shift from proto-dragon to true dragon. It was not that Galakron had actually fathered all true dragons. That was a myth somehow spread millennia ago. But that after him had come the five aspects and their respective dragon flights. Proto-dragons had all but vanished after that. We do find some when we go to Northrend when we start playing Lich King, but that's something entirely different. We thought they were gone, but they're still there. They should have that in this book, but the might be a small discrepancy. That happens from time to time if they don't tell the authors about that. There were other legends concerning Galakron, but in truth, Kalik understood that only his three counterparts knew the truth. He had never thought to ask them about the father of dragons, but now wished that he had. Yet, Kalik's momentary awe soon gave way again to his anger and frustration, and growing concern over his being trapped in these ancient visions. Each one seemed more and more lifelike, as if his own time were the fantasy and this scene were now the true present. Not the first time. He tried to will himself back, but nothing changed. He continued to be an insignificant, unnoticed phantom trapped within Malagos. Not even Alexstrasza or Ysera, both of whom in the future would have abilities that should make them sense his presence, so much as glanced in curiosity at the male beside them. "I will be free," Kalik abruptly roared, though his roar went unheard of by any save himself. Bereft of a throat, or a body, he felt like nothing but a memory remembered by no one. Laughter filled his, or rather, Malagos's ears. Kalik at first thought that someone mocked him, but instead, the laughter was aimed at other proto-dragons by a charcoal gray male, a bit larger than most, who actually sneered at the others. "Little hatchlings," he bellowed, "afraid of the sky, afraid of the ground. Galakron laughs at you for being afraid, and I, Neltharion, do too." Some of the proto-dragons hissed at the gray male, but no one challenged him. By their glances, they knew him to be strong and able to back up his taunt. Even those proto-dragons who clearly had little more intelligence than their prey appeared to know better than to fight. Neltharion. The name finally penetrated. Kalik sought in vain to seize control of Malagos's body as the newcomer, still laughing, flew off. Where Galakron had been a startling, unsettling thing of legend, this gray male represented a danger to the future of all life on Azeroth. If there was a creature more evil than Neltharion, Kalik could not think of one. Of course, by the Blue's time, the gray male would be better known by his more apt title, Deathwing. Azeroth had suffered many terrible times and menaces, the demons of the Burning Legion and the Sundering but two of the most devastating. Yet to the dragons, to many inhabitants of the world, there had been no greater peril than the mad aspect. From the War of the Ancients 10,000 years ago to recent times, he who had once been the Earth Warder had sought the destruction of all things. Deathwing was gone now, and at a tremendous sacrifice, but Kalik, still able to watch Neltharion flying into the clouds through Malagos's gaze, wondered how Azeroth would have fared if Deathwing had never been. Follow him, he urged Malagos to Noville. Follow him and end the horror before it begins. His host did nothing. Malagos lost interest not only in Neltharion, but also in all else going on around him. Without a word to Alexstrasza or Ysera, he leapt into the air and headed to the north. A few proto-dragons nearby hissed at Malagos as he passed, but the icy blue male ignored them. He had eaten his fill and only wanted to curl up in his remote cavern for a long, pleasant nap while he digested his meal. That Kalik had no desire to do the same was, as usual, lost upon the proto-dragon. But suddenly something hard collided with Malagos from behind. He rolled in the sky, then began to plummet. As he struggled to regain control, both he and Kalik caught a glimpse of the cause of their troubles. Koros and another male of the same hue dived down to attack. Malagos managed to slow his descent, but could still not right himself. Koros and his comrade hissed eagerly as they neared. Malagos opened his mouth. A shower of icicles shot forth. Koros evaded them, but the other proto-dragon did not entirely avoid being struck. The icicles slashed through one wing. Once more, Malagos was hit from behind by a third foe entering the fray. Kalik, helplessly watching, guessed that Koros had set up this attack long before Galakron's appearance. From Malagos's jumbled thoughts, Kalik picked up bits of a long rivalry over territory, prey, and who was more cunning. At the moment, it seemed that Koros had the advantage in the last. Koros exhaled, and what appeared to be a web of smoke enveloped Malagos. The icy blue male fought for breath as the smoke sealed off his nostrils and mouth. Despite his wounds, the first of Koros's companions re-entered the struggle. With an eager expression, the proto-dragon opened wide as he sought Malagos's throat. Thunder roiled, or rather a sound like thunder. Malagos's wounded attacker dropped as if hit by 1,000 dwarven hammers. A hearty laugh followed the jarring sound. Kalik saw a gray blur cross Malagos's path, then collide with Koros. You want to fight? Fight me! Great Neltharion as he grappled with Malagos's rival. This was a foe that Koros could not have counted on, but he did not back down. He opened wide, and Neltharion slammed the blue-green's jaw up, closing the mouth at a critical moment. Koros jerked away from his opponent. The blue-green male clawed at his mouth, ripping away scale and skin until he managed to open it again. Neltharion's act had managed to turn the other proto-dragon's breath weapon against him in a manner both Malagos and Kalik admired. Now, another discrepancy. A proto-dragon has very small upper arms and bigger legs, arms, whatever, in the back. So I don't think they could have really clawed at their face. But yeah, that's a little off, but that's all right. Yeah. No, he's writing this without having seen any of the creatures, all he knows is like proto dragon is like something different, but he doesn't know exactly how they're supposed to look, so discrepancies happen. Okay. However, the Grey's amusement at his success left him open to the third of the attackers. The remaining blue-green landed atop Neltharion, wrapping his hind paws around the Grey's throat. At the same time, he sought to bite through one of Neltharion's wings. But in the next second, the Grey's foes was torn free of his prey by Malagos, who had finally had the opportunity to recover. Malagos ripped at the other proto-dragon's wings and neck, scoring 2 strong strikes. Blood spattered his muzzle as he tore into his target. A wildly flapping wing hit Malagos hard in the face. It startled him enough to make him loosen his grip. His adversary used that moment to pull free. Rather than turn to fight, the wounded Leviathan retreated as swiftly as he could. Another of the attackers soared past Malagos. Only belatedly did Kalik and his host note the fleeting figure as Koros. Of the final member of the treacherous trio, there was no sign. "Too short! Cowards! Come! Fight again!" Eltharion roared at the 2 diminishing figures. Despite their clear victory, Malagos radiated no interest in wreaking further damage on his old rival. He watched silently as the Grey continued to berate the losers until they were out of sight. Finally losing interest, Eltharion spun to face Malagos. "You fight good. Not as good as Galakron, not good as me, but good." Malagos nodded. "You fight very good. Malagos thanks you." An attempt of gratitude received a hearty laugh. "No, thank you. It was a good fight." Malagos did not shrink from a battle, but unlike Eltharion, did not savor it. Within, Kalik remained torn between being relieved that Eltharion had come to their aid and feeling anxious that the future Deathwing hovered before them. A good fight, yes. The icy blue proto-dragon finally agreed. "We are brothers in blood," Eltharion continued, shifting closer. "Both smarter than the others, too." The other proto-dragon did not disagree. For all his bluster, Eltharion was clever. Malagos's interest turned to another astonishing subject stirred up by the chance mentioning from the Grey. "Galakron. He never hunts here. Why now? You know?" "Ha! Galakron hunts where Galakron wishes." Yet after saying that, Eltharion paused. After visible consideration, he added, "More food. Yes, more food here." "More food," Malagos agreed. A horrifying thought occurred to the proto-dragon. "Our food." Eltharion understood immediately. "Our food. Not good. No, not." Something on one of the nearby hills to Malagos's right caused the proto-dragon's attention. Malagos immediately glanced away, enabling Kalik to also look. "They come back?" Grey eagerly asked, referring to Koros and the other 2. "No." Malagos remained distracted by whatever he had noticed, but his thoughts remained murky to Kalik. Malagos suddenly arced toward those hills, a curious Eltharion accompanying him. They arrived but scant seconds later, whereupon Malagos began to survey this vicinity. "Nothing here," Eltharion concluded long before his companion was satisfied. "No enemy to fight." "Shame." "No enemy," Malagos reluctantly agreed. Again, the future aspect noticed something at the edge of his vision. This time he reacted even more quickly. "Something?" Grey asked with rising interest. Malagos squinted. Kalik saw nothing through his host, but felt Malagos tense as if he did. So powerful a sensitivity. The words were not Kalik's, nor were they Malagos's thoughts. Despite being well aware by now that he had no true voice, Kalik could not hold back a gasp of discovery. To him, part of the landscape moved. A ripple, a little bigger than a tall human. It moved only a short distance to the side, and did so slowly, almost as if seeing what would happen. To the eyes of most, it would have been unnoticeable, and Eltharion was evidence of that. He snorted and peered elsewhere while he patiently waited for Malagos to finish. "Look there! Look there!" Kalik demanded fruitlessly. Yet it became clear to him that Malagos did not quite see what he did. Malagos finally gave up, turning back to Eltharion. And in that one instant, Kalik, not his host, saw what watched. And as he did, the world spun madly. Kalik became lost in a black maelstrom. He had nothing upon which to grab hold, either physically or mentally. The blue sank into dark, endless hole, only to wake up on the floor of his sanctum, his body still contorted, part dragon, part half... His still contorted, part dragon, half-elven body, washed in sweat. Groaning, Kalik dragged himself toward a nearby wall. As he approached, a small shimmering fountain of silver water rose from thin air. It directed itself slowly toward the transforming dragon, who opened his stretching muzzle wide and swallowed the cool, refreshing contents. As the magical liquid coursed through him, Kalik's mind began to reorganize itself. His first thought was not about what he had seen in that last moment, but about the true bane of his existence. Managing to rise, the blue dragon returned to the secret place where he had put the artifact. Not at all to his surprise, it glowed as if it had first noticed in the waste. The glow faded immediately, but Kalik was not fooled. The artifact was active and had probably been active from the moment that he had sensed its existence. Kalik no longer cared for what purpose it had been designed. He wanted nothing more than to either destroy it or cast it far, far away. Well aware of the potential for disaster when dealing with any magical object, Kalik chose the latter course. He pictured a place obscure to most and used the spell to send the accursed artifact there. An immense wave of relief overcame him. Kalik slumped back, grateful for the peace of the moment. Without meaning to, his attention returned to the essence of the visions. Malagos, Alexstrasza, Ysera, and Neltharion. 4 of those who would change Azeroth forever as its guiding aspects. Kalik assumed that somewhere in those visions a young Nosdormu had also appeared. The analytical part of Kalik wondered what these visions meant, the emotional part wanting nothing to do with them. Each vision burned deeper into the blue's mind. Kalik feared that if they had progressed, the visions would have eventually stolen his mind. He returned to the magical fountain, a creation of his own that now proved highly beneficial. At last satiated, Kalik forced the visions from his thoughts. He had more important, more immediate concerns. A thing of horror rose before him, a cadaverous dragon with sunken white eyes and shriveled flesh, rotting tongue dangling to the side. It lunged for Kalik and vanished. Kalik shivered. His heart beat wildly. The stench of decay still lingered in his nostrils, even though it slowly dawned on him that what he had seen had not actually stood before him, but rather had been a product of his imagination. It took much to unnerve one of his kind even for a moment, but this horrific sight had certainly done so. Kalik could still not shake the sense that he had smelled the apparition, although that was impossible. As Kalik's calm returned, his first thought involved the artifact, but it was hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Kalik could not believe that it could affect him from so far. Still, the more he recalled glimpses of the macabre illusion, the more details that hinted at the artifact's connection came to light. This had been no dragon, but a proto-dragon whose size had been shaped by Kalik's own mind. And the blue had not even thought about proto-dragons until finding the accursed thing under Galakrond's frozen bones. Galakrond. Voices arose all around Kalik, but he knew immediately that they came from within, not without. The thing is dead. This thing cannot fight. Kalik roared, his cry echoing through his sanctum. The roar did nothing to drown out the ever-increasing voices. The dragon desperately spun around, his tail crashing against the wall with such force that it cracked the rock. I will not listen. I will not succumb. So many dead. We cannot fight. It must be done, no matter the sacrifice. The last voice cut through the rest. With it came another manifestation in Kalik's mind, one so real that yet again he thought it stood before him, the hooded, robed figure. The phantasm vanished back into the darkness within. Kalik remained utterly still, afraid that if he even moved, the entire madness would begin again. When it did not, he took a long breath and thought hard. He could think of only one recourse. He would have to seek out Alexstrasza again. Foremost, the task of finding her, the one who had once been the life-binder, would have proved daunting. Alexstrasza stayed in no place for very long, perhaps because if she did, she might dwell too long on what had been lost. Kalik understood that she had come to grips with the fact that the dragons as a race were no longer viable, that the last eggs had hatched, and from here there would only be fewer and fewer dragons as time and circumstance took their toll. I guess that explains why when the Dragon Isles appeared again, she was absolutely ecstatic about finding more dragon eggs and hoping that that will all hatch. Yet perhaps some lingering link from their roles as aspects, or simply because he understood her more than he realized, Kalik located her after only a few false trails. He flew low over the forested land, finally transforming into his humanoid form a good distance from his goal. He did the last not only because he sought to surprise her, but rather so as not to frighten the inhabitants of the human villages that he had seen in the distance. The giggles of children reached him before he found her. Kalik saw the four youngsters playing amongst the trees just beyond the village's boundaries. The game of hide-and-seek seemed to be a fluid one, where the seeker appeared to change from one moment to the next. A man's voice called the children back into the village. There was always the danger of wolves or other threats, although this land appeared fairly peaceful in comparison to many in the changed world. Moreover, considering the two figures now nearby, the children and their village were, for a short time, safe from almost anything. They seemed very happy, Kalik commented. A part of the tree to his left separated. The facade of bark faded, revealing a beautiful fiery-tressed woman dressed in form-fitting gold and crimson armor. She loomed over Kalik and appeared to be from some far more glorious and mysterious elven branch. A regal crimson cloak followed behind her as she joined him. "They are so young," she murmured, her brilliant red eyes somber. "They have such vitality. I see why coral straws enjoyed their particular kind so much." Kalik briefly bowed his head in memory of perhaps the most legendary of Alexstrasza's consorts, even though his own relationship with Corielstrasz, who had also worked among the younger races as the mage Crassus, had been tempestuous at times, to say the least. They had come to an understanding well before the Red Male's death, but Kalik felt some guilt about their past schism whenever Alexstrasza brought up her beloved mate. Humans hold much hope, but they do also hold much threat. We could not help finally responding. The Lich King was once human, and many of those who fought him hardest were human too. She returned her gaze to the village. "Was there something you wanted?" He suddenly felt so very young, almost as young as the children they had been watching. I wanted to ask some things of you when we gathered at Wormrest. The gathering ended so quickly, so abruptly." Alexstrasza looked back. "I am so very sorry. We did not treat you with the respect we should have. The moment just overtook the rest of us. It's not an excuse. We were remiss." "I am aware that you three share something I can barely fathom. I am still honored that I was chosen, even if for a short time, Kalik exhaled sharply. Alexstrasza, after the three of you left Wormrest, I found an artifact of an unsettling nature. I need your guidance. Guidance? For the first time, she did not look pleased with his presence. My advice will avail you. Will avail you, little Kale. Okay, let me try that again. My advice will avail you little, Kalik. I would think that you, being a blue, would certainly be better at deciphering some artifact's design and purpose than I. In fact, the children ran into sight again. Although they remained within the confines of the village, their playing was still visible enough to draw Alexstrasza's attention. She clapped her hands together in delight as the small girl paused in her play to hug what was likely her slightly older brother. Kalik started to talk, then noticed how strained her smile actually was. He envisioned all the lost lives, especially those young like these children, and how they had affected the former aspect inside. Alexstrasza herself had suffered more than most. Not only had all her eggs been destroyed by Corielstras in the act sacrificing himself to prevent their corruption into monstrous twilight dragons, and her ability to lay more had been forever taken away. But in addition to all that, she lived with the knowledge that the other dragonflights had also suffered so. She might have accepted her loss of power, but not this loss of her kind's future. After all, she had been the Lifebinder. Stepping back, Kalik left Alexstrasza to her viewing. He could not bring himself to pursue matters with her. In silence, he strode deeper into the forest, waiting only till he was far enough not to frighten the humans before transforming into his true form and flying off. Twice now, his hopes of understanding and guidance from one of the elder dragons had ended in futility. Alexstrasza had even intentionally pulled away from him when he had mentioned the mysterious find. True, as a blue, he was still more in tune with all facets of magic, but her experience might have proven invaluable. They have withdrawn from the world, he realized. They have accepted their loss of power, as have I, but now they no longer see themselves as part of Azeroth's future. Kayla could only imagine how Alexstrasza and the others, with so many millennia of burdens upon them, felt dead. It is dead. It should not fight. Another. Beware. Another. Intense vertigo once again overtook Kalik. The blue dragon tumbled forward, dropping hard as he did. He crashed into several tree trunks before being able to right himself. The voices receded. Kalik, exhausted by the struggle, landed hard, then blacked out. He woke what seemed barely a few seconds later. The voices had completely disappeared and no visions assailed him. Kalik rose gratefully, peering around as he tried to regain his bearings. The dragon's gleaming eyes widened in shock. He was no longer near the region where he had left Alexstrasza. The trees around him were more sparsely spread, and a deep, twisting canyon stretched for miles to the north. This nameless location was far from any civilized area, either alliance or horde. Very likely few knew it to any degree, but of those few, Kalik suspect that he knew this region most of all. Some force had transported Kalik far across Azeroth, and the blue dragon had looked no further than the accursed artifact, which suddenly lay only a few yards before him, once more ominously aglow. The blue dragon exhaled furiously at the artifact, enveloping it in bitter frost. He brought down one heavy paw on the now glistening relic. Where good steel, stood brittle by the magical chill, would have easily shattered, Kalik's odd nemesis retained near every aspect of his essence, leaving the dragon with a very pained appendage. "You will not be my master," the blue roared, not caring if anyone heard the echo of his voice. "Curse someone else, you fiendish toy!" The octagonal relic grew brighter yet. Expecting the worst, Kalik immediately pulled back. Nothing happened. Kalik ran a paw over the piece, but still the artifact did nothing. Even then, the blue could not help feeling that with each passing second, the mysterious object insinuated itself deeper and deeper, not only in the dragon's mind, but also any soul one of his kind might have. Seizing up the relic, Kalik prepared to throw it deep into the valley. However, as he raised his arm, the limb ached terribly. Indeed, not only did the blue feel the stress and strain all over his body, Kalik felt as if he had flown halfway around the world. Flown. Testing his wings, Kalik found that they too moved with pain. The Leviathan's anger kindled anew. It had been his own magic and muscle that had dragged him all the way to this land. He could only imagine how he had made the journey. Had he flown unconscious all that time? It does not matter, Kalik forcefully reminded himself. All that matters is to free myself from its foulness. But how he could do that remained a question unanswerable. Rather than cast the artifact away again, Kalik pressed it tight to his chest and leapt into the air. No sooner had he done so than Kalik abruptly veered north. As if by some miracle, he felt as if he suddenly knew how to divest himself of the monstrous relic. With great sweeps of his wings, the blue dragon headed to the very place from which he had dug out the artifact, the frozen bones of Galakrond. Fighting his exhaustion, Kalik continued his hard pace and managed to reach the dragon blight as dark approached. The wastes in the dragon graveyard came into view soon after. Kalik spotted the outline of the temple, then adjusted his path accordingly. Even in the gloom, the ancient behemoth's skeleton was somehow visible where the remains of the 100 of other dragons who had passed on during the many successive millennia were now no more than dark mounds. Kalik landed in silence, feeling suddenly as if he disturbed their rest. Still, now that he had come this far, the blue had no intention of turning back. Recalling where he had dug up the relic, Kalik transformed, then created a faint golden globe to light his path. Now holding the artifact in the crook of his left arm, the false half-elf closed on the towering skeleton. The wind tore through the graveyard and the icy ground crunched under his boots. A long lingering moan sent a chill of a different type down his spine. He paused, the floating globe moving by his will in the direction of the terrible cry. Seeing nothing, Kalik took a step toward the sound. After a moment, he finally realized that the moan was the wind blowing through the eye socket of the gargantuan creature's skull. A new shiver ran through Kalik as he recalled his visions of the living Galakrond. That such a being had lived, a proto-dragon that dwarfed dragons, filled him with awe. Galakrond was legend, but to see the legend living. But then disturbing thoughts arose. Kalik wondered what place Galakrond had in this madness. The one vision appeared to have focused on him. Kalik vowed that once he had finished the foul thing resting in his arm, he would still try to find out more from one of his former counterparts. The blue had little else to do anymore. Seeing the area from a much lower perspective, Kalik noticed things that he had not before. In the glow he noted footprints. It had never occurred to him that this sacred place had been visited by other creatures. Some of the prints were large, although not as large as those of dragons. The round blunt shape indicated the presence of Magnetar, huge savage hunters whose lower half resembled the body of a woolly mammoth, while the upper torso was like some bestial version of a night elf or a human with giant tusks. Why the Magnetar had been hunting in the waste was a question that was not satisfactorily answered by the small hooved tracks Kalik noted. At least two of the buys in Lake Tonka had also been through this area, which was situated fairly far from their home territory. The Tonka were also more civilized than Magnetar and had a great respect for the dead, which made their being here more curious. Something long and thin lay at the edge of the globe's illumination. Directing the globe closer, Calyx saw that it was a Magnetar spear. The tip, partially visible, was stained with blood, and the Blue noticed that some of the ice close to the point was dark. The Magnetar had brought down its prey, but there was no sign of the body. Calyx supposed that the beasts had taken away the unfortunate Tonka's corpse for food. With disgust, Calyx turned back to the rib cage. He stepped up to the nearest of the high arcing bones, and after hesitation stepped within the Father of Dragons. The moment he did, Calyx sensed that he was not alone. He quickly sent the globe forward. A thickly furred female Tonka stood under the arch of another rib. She leaned on a primitive spear made of some long bone and tipped with rock hones sharp. "Hail to you, dragon," the white bison-headed hunter rumbled as she bowed. She was clad in the simple leather garments which she had no doubt fashioned from her own kills. "I am Bunique. I did not mean any sacrilege here." That she had seen him transformed despite the darkness did not surprise Calyx. In a land where it was often as dark as night, even in the day, a good Tonka hunter had to have fair night vision. "I've no quarrel with you, Bunique," the Blue returned. He kept the artifact as well hidden by his arm as possible, even subtly shifting the glowing orb so that it slightly blinded the Tonka. She raised her other hand to shield her eyes. "Nor I with you. My kind do not come here often, but I was in search of a relic from this place to bring back and thus prove myself worthy of him who loves me." Calyx held his surprise at her reason for being here, but assumed she could not possibly be hunting what he carried. Growing impatient to finish burying the foul thing, he curtly replied, "I will not stop you from going on with your search then." "This ground is as sacred to us as it is to you," the Tonka went on, as if not hearing him. "The Magnetar, they care nothing about anything. They seek only to fill their stomachs." Lowering her hand, Bunique took a step toward him. "But for as long as there have been Tonka, we have respected the resting place of the Great Ones." "And I am pleased to hear that, but—" She set the butt of the spear on the ground again, right next to the very hole to which Calyx was heading. "A world without dragons. That would be a strange place. Not so good. There would be no harmony. The world is hard enough to survive. The world needs dragons." Calyx chose not to comment on the adverse effect Deathwing and Malygos had had on Azeroth. Instead, he sought some other way in which to hint to the overly talkative Tonka that she should depart. Suddenly, he noticed that Bunique was no longer standing before him. Calyx spun and discovered her near the rib by which he had just passed. The Blue could not recall her walking past him, but Bunique, her back now to him, clearly must have. The sphere illuminated several of her steps in the chilly ground. As if sensing him watching, she looked back. The Tonka's large brown eyes focused not on Calyx, but rather on the crook of his arm. "Some things should not remain buried," Bunique quietly commented. "Fare you well, Red Dragon." Somehow Calyx's hold on the relic slipped. Looking down, he seized it before it could fall free. Straightening again, he demanded, "What do you mean by—" But Bunique was nowhere to be in view. Directing the sphere toward where he had last seen her, Calyx could not even find any trace of the tracks he had seen a moment ago. The Blue stepped back. He refused to think that the Tonka had been some figment of his imagination. What he suspected was that the foul artifact had once more toyed with him. Kalik focused on reburying the relic and leaving its madness behind. He started to set it back into the hole. Then, in the light of the sphere, he noticed something where Bunique had momentarily set her spear. A hand. The blue swore. Despite where it lay, the hand was almost entirely intact, and though it was of a similar appearance, the lost appendage was clearly larger than that of a human or a dwarf. It had a peculiar gray coloring that also unsettled Kalik. However, after a closer study, what he had thought flesh proved to be the remnants of a glove. How he had missed the hand last time, Kalik discovered quickly. A chunk of frosty ground had covered it until Bunique's spear had loosened the dirt. The blue glanced over his shoulder, almost certain that she would be standing there, but of the Tonka there remained no sign. Despite the grisly find, Kalik nearly dismissed it until he saw that there was something else caught in the palm. It was small, round, and at first appeared to be glass. However, when Kalik dared touch it, he felt an odd warmth. The octagonal artifact began to glow blue. Blue, not lavender. With an even stronger epithet, Kalik stumbled back. What this meant now he did not know. The relic fell from his arm, landing atop the gloved hand. The world flashed blindingly bright. "This is not true," said a voice Kalik recognized as young Ysera's. "They are wrong." "He is not very smart," Malagos's voice returned, "but smart enough." Suddenly Kalik could see again, and what he saw was another shriveled proto-dragon corpse. This one had once been ivory, but now looked dusty white. Like the previous one, the face was contorted, as if the death had been agonizing. Malagos's gaze swept past Ysera and a briefly viewed fire-orange figure that Kalik assumed was her sister, to another location a little farther off. There, a second corpse lay sprawled. This one still retained some of the icy blue coloring that marked it as one of Malagos's own. And apparently a proto-dragon Malagos knew. Various emotions played out, including those attached to memories of younger days. A name, Taras, came to Kalik's mind. As juveniles, Malagos and Taras had hunted together while learning the proper tactics. Kalik noticed that he felt his host's emotions more clearly than ever. There was some change in the vision, some new vividness, as if Kalik were now even more a part of it than ever. There was not a thought that, under the current circumstances, comforted him. Malagos's thoughts came as both words and images. There were tales being told, unthinkable tales. Malagos did not know what to make of them. Ysera thought them false, while Alexstrasza believed that they should at least be considered. Galakrond had supposedly slain these and at least a dozen others. The source of this discovery huddled next to Alexstrasza, somehow managing to look smaller than Ysera despite that not being the case. Purple in color, he looked half dead himself. "Swallowed them up! Swallowed them up!" he repeated over and over. "These are not swallowed," Ysera pointed out, still showing her disbelief. "Galakrond not like them?" "Swallowed them up." Ysera scowled. The purple cowered more. Her tone reassuring, Alexstrasza murmured something in his ear. The scowl's focus shifted to Ysera's sister, but Alexstrasza pointedly ignored it. From his host, Kalik understood that the sisters had come across the shell of a proto-dragon and, after listening to what Malagos secretly half-considered babbling from the purple, had gone in search of the icy blue male. Malagos did not know exactly why they had decided to come to him, save that he was very clever. Trying to find a way to continue to be clever to them, he eyed the corpses. More around? More. Yes, more. The purple male glanced nervously to the west, to where the land first rose to a high ridge, then dropped some distance. The party had come from the east, and so had only to glance to look at. The party had come from the east, and so had only a glancing view of that direction. Malagos had been to the area before. The hunting for grazers was excellent here during the spring, and remembered only that there was a river below, knowledge that certainly was irrelevant to the moment. Not sure what he expected to find, Malagos headed in that direction. Kalik was also curious and glad that his mind and that of the proto-dragon seemed so in sync. Kalik observed everything that passed his host's gaze, and suddenly noticed some marks in the dirt that looked as if a creature the size of Malagos had dragged itself toward a ridge. His host did not see what he did, at least not at first. Only when he had just reached the top of the ridge did Malagos abruptly turn and eyed the trail with interest. He leaned over the tracks, sniffing them. Particular stench, yet one not all that unfamiliar to either, filled his nostrils. On the other side of the ridge, rocks clattered. Malagos whirled. The dreadful vision that Kalik had experienced in the Nexus rose up over the ridge to attack his host. The rotting flesh, the sunken white eyes. Even having seen the fiend before did not keep Kalik from wanting to pull back. But Malagos threw himself towards the monstrosity, exhaling at the same time. His frosty breath enveloped the undead proto-dragon, freezing it, but only for a second. Barely slowly, the shriveled corpse shook off the frost and continued its attack. The stench of decomposing meat sickened both Kalik and his host as they collided with the ghoulish creature. Yellowed fangs sought Malagos's throat. Claws tore at his chest. Up close, the undead proto-dragon's countenance was even more awful, much of the skin having at some point been scorched. The scorched areas, more sensitive to decay, had crumbled inward in many places, giving Malagos and Kalik a view of the bloody, ruined interior of their foe's head. As Malagos inhaled for a second attempt, the undead startled him by doing just the opposite. A putrid green cloud covered Malagos's head, filling his mouth and snout and burning into his eyes. Nausea overcame him, and as a result, also Kalik. To both it felt as if their insides were putrefying. Malagos weakened, falling to his front knees. A tremendous whooshing sound, followed by intense heat, jarred Kalik and his host to a full consciousness again. Claws pulled Malagos back from the heat. His eyes cleared enough to give both a watery glimpse of what happened. Alexstrasza stood before their ghoulish foe, exhaling more fire on the undead proto-dragon. The creature burned well, but still it did not fall. It converged on the fire-orange female. "Let go!" Malagos commanded Ysera, who was the one who had pulled him to safety. She obeyed immediately. Although still reeling from the undead's ghastly breath weapon, Malagos knew that he had to help Alexstrasza in turn. Malagos exhaled forcefully. It made his head swim, and even Kalik thought they were about to black out. But somehow Malagos retained his sense of mind as the chilling breath joined the female's own strike. More brittle now due to the flames, the undead proto-dragon cracked and crumbled with the additional and opposing force turned on it. A wing already fragmented broke off, followed by one forelimb. The fiend pressed forward, only to lose its tail and a hindpaw. The corpse collapsed, shattering as it hit the hard ground. Alexstrasza looked in relief to Malagos, but Kalik's host had already spun around in Ysera's direction. Kalik at first thought Malagos had gone mad, but then sensed what concerned him. Malagos fluttered up into the air just long enough to pass over Ysera. Of the cowering proto-dragon there was no sign. Both Malagos and Kalik assumed that he had wisely fled. Still, he was not Malagos's target. That was the first corpse upon which they had come. Corpse that Kalik saw was beginning to move. The icy blue proto-dragon fell upon the stirring body. To Kalik's dismay, his host sank his teeth deep into the corpse's throat. Malagos ripped away flesh and bone with abandon, even as the body tried to shake free. With one last vicious tug, Malagos tore off the upper part of the neck. The head flailed, the jaw seeking the living proto-dragon's own throat. Malagos twisted around, then released his hold. The severed head spiraled through the air, then landed yards away. Its jaws clacked several times before the head finally lay still. The body quieted a moment later. Malagos shook the foul-tasting bits out of his mouth and turned toward the remaining corpse. But Alexstrasza and Ysera had already torn that one to shreds. It did not move, Ysera said after also shaking rotting flesh free. We did not want it to. Malagos nodded, but then saw a troubling expression on Alexstrasza's face. She studied the landscape, then looked at the others. More dead, he said. The fire-orange female reminded him. Where are they? There came a plaintive cry from far away, one that made the unseen Kalik think of the cowering proto-dragon. Malagos instantly turned. Kalik found himself not only back in his own time, but once again a dragon. In addition, he was flying through the night sky. The artifact and the round glassy fragment both clutched tight. The second piece lay attached to the top of the octagonal artifact, revealing that both had been one from the beginning and had merely been separated by time and circumstance until now. Yet that did not bother the blue nearly as much as discovering his body acting on what he considered its own accord, or as if another mind controlled it. Kalik halted, hovering over the dark landscape, some of the jagged mountains of Northrend on the edge of the Dragonblight, he belatedly noted, and trying to decide what he could do. One desperate hope quickly came to mind. If I can't bury it, maybe I could just let them shatter. Without hesitation, Kalik released his hold. The combined relics plummeted toward the hungry mountains. A sense of foreboding suddenly filled the blue. He dived after the relics. Far below, their illumination swelled. Kalik roared in protest even as he felt himself lose connection with the waking world to which he had only just returned. He had one last glimpse of the sharp, rocky land racing up at him before plunging into the darkness within again. For a single heartbeat, there was utter silence. Then, the voices rose from the darkness. They quickly grew from whispers to a manic cacophony that threatened to deafen the blue. The voices turned into frantic cries. The world burst into focus again. Shrieking proto-dragons darted through the cloudy sky. A thundering roar shook the warmer but still mountainous region Kalik now found himself, or rather Malagos, in. Something suddenly blotted out what light there was. Malagos looked up. Both Kalik and he beheld the underside of the titanic proto-dragon that could be none other than Galakrond. Kalik felt the fear that touched Malagos, but it was fear combined with the determination to live. Fear was no thing of shame, not when confronted by such a horrific threat. Malagos retained his focus, diving down toward a crevice just as Galakrond fell upon a silver-blue proto-dragon too panicked to choose one direction over another fast enough to evade the much swifter behemoth. To Kalik's horror, Galakrond swallowed the smaller proto-dragon whole. Only then did Kalik notice something even more disconcerting about the father of dragons. Galakrond's body seemed distended in odd places, especially his gullet. What's happening here? Why is he doing this? Kalik wondered. But there was no chance to seek an answer through Malagos, For just then something collided with Calyx's host. Unprepared, Malagos flapped wildly as he sought to regain control. Through his eyes, Calyx briefly noticed Koros hovering near the area before Malagos's spinning took the sneering proto-dragon from view. The blue and white proto-dragon's fury infected Calyx as well, and as Malagos righted himself, Calyx looked forward to seeing his host deal with his rival. Yet before Malagos could act, a dread shadow enshrouded him. The proto-dragon looked up, directly into the vast gullet of Galakrond. The jaws closed on Malagos, and Calyx. Okay, that's the first part. There's 5 other parts, so give me one moment to pull that up. They're just small serials that becomes a whole book, basically. So let me pull up the next one. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun. Here's part 2. Part 2. Open. There we go. All right, we're in part 2 now. All right. The hot, malodorous breath nearly overwhelmed Calyx and his host as the jaws closed. Calyx wondered if perhaps it would be best for Malagos to let the stench knock them out, so that they would not feel the monster's teeth crush through their shared flesh and bone. A violent, steaming burst of wind suddenly threw Malagos back. The burst was accompanied by an odd, muffled thunder. At the same time, Galakron's maw opened wide again, enabling Malagos to tumble to freedom. Finally out of range, the blue and white proto-dragon frantically righted himself. As he did, both he and Calyx saw the source of Malagos' salvation. With a defiant laugh, Neltharion darted away from under Galakron's throat. Galakron hacked, creating another powerful explosion of wind that forced back not only Malagos, but also other proto-dragons in its path. Neltharion had struck at the weakest point just at the right moment, an attack that Calyx would have thought foolhardy at best at times. Even while regaining his breath, Galakron had the cunning and fury to snatch at his tiny attacker as the charcoal gray proto-dragon dived. Claws as large as Neltharion closed on him, but at the last second a fearsome blast of what appeared to Calyx to be sand half-blinded Galakron. A dust-brown male veered off. Galakron shook his head to clear his vision, enabling his prey to make good their escape. Neltharion flew directly toward Malagos. "Fly or die!" It was good advice to both Calyx and Malagos, but as Malagos turned, Galakron's roar arose from behind them. The roar was accompanied by a swooshing sound and punctuated by a heavy thud in Neltharion's pained grunt. Peering over his shoulder, Malagos saw that where the titanic monster's claw had missed, Galakron's long, thick tail had not. Several times the length of Galakron's hind limb, it easily caught Neltharion on the side, striking him hard. Stunned, the gray male spiraled towards the harsh ground below. Perhaps Galakron intended to pursue, but a panicked yellow female chose that moment to pass near enough in the gigantic proto-dragon's field of vision to attract his attention. With an eager roar, the hungry behemoth gave chase. Unheedful of this stroke of luck, Malagos had already dived after Neltharion. The other male had endangered himself to save Malagos, and Calyx saw without surprise that his host could do no less. The blue and white proto-dragon stretched hard to reach the plummeting figure, but even as swift as he was, it was clear to Malagos and Calyx that there would be no catching Neltharion before the gray struck the ground. A fire-orange form rose from below, colliding with the stunned male. Alexstrasza grunted hard as she and the bulkier Neltharion hit, but somehow the female managed to maintain control. For a few vital seconds, she stopped Neltharion's fatal descent, just long enough for Malagos to reach the pair. Without a word, he gripped Neltharion by the shoulders, hefting the large male up and relieving Alexstrasza of her burden. She in turn rose and assisted him with carrying Neltharion away from the vicinity. Through Malagos, Kalik observed the area and found it astonishingly devoid of blood and torn flesh. He realized that Galakron had swallowed nearly all of his victims whole. In some ways, the Blue found that even more horrific, imagining how those proto-dragons had felt as they vanished in the behemoth's gullet. So many, Alexstrasza gasped as they flew. So many. Malagos said nothing, but his thoughts mirrored her words. Kalik's host was just as shocked by the events as she was. A new sound rumbled through the area, a sound so odd, so unnerving that the two proto-dragons nearly lost their grip on Neltharion. The sound grew more intense, more guttural, and because of that, more terrifying. Kalik still had no idea what it could be, but Malagos at last identified it with something from his own experience. Images flashed through Kalik's mind, images of his host regurgitating bits of bone and other inedible parts of various prey. Somewhere, Kalik understood with growing sickness, Galakron was doing something akin to that, only what he was disgorging was not the remnants of any buffalo or fish. Kalik's world suddenly swam again. His consciousness was torn from Malagos. Visions of Galakron feasting ran through Kalik's thoughts, and then the accursed darkness overtook the Blue. Yet, once more, a familiar voice called him from that darkness. Kalik! Kalik? Why Jaina called him this time the dragon did not know, but with what sense he already had, Kalik blocked his thoughts from her notice. Even as he did that, he felt the world around him return. A harsh wind struck his face. Kalik instinctively shifted position and discovered himself slipping. At last able to open his eyes, the Blue watched a rocky ridge slide up over him. Kalik realized that he was falling. With one paw he dug his claws into dirt and stone, managing to slow his descent but not to stop it. Kalik tried to use the other paw, but it remained tightly shut despite his desperate need. He toppled backwards, finding out then that there was not a ridge from which he had slipped, but a mountain. Kalik sought to right himself, only to have one wing clip the mountainside and send him tumbling faster. Below the Blue, jagged rocks that reminded him too much of Galakron's teeth shot toward him. Managing to focus, Kalik cast a spell. His wild descent slowed nearly to a halt. It was a very short-term solution, but he hoped that it would not need more than a few moments. Catching his breath, the Blue Dragon rolled onto his stomach. Already feeling the hastily cast spell dissipating, Kalik flapped hard. As he regained flight, his spell faded away. The Blue Dragon alighted on another mountain. There was no continued call from Jaina. He hoped that she had given up. Either way, Kalik had only one interest now, and that was the foul thing still gripped in his paw. The now complete artifact seemed to taunt him with its persistent glow. There was naturally no point in throwing it away. It would somehow return to plague him. He also doubted the wisdom of attempting to destroy it again. Kalik let the wind clear his head as he struggled to decide what to do next. If not for Jaina's voice, the Blue would not have even been certain that he was in his own time and in his own body. It was becoming harder to separate reality from vision. After several fruitless minutes of ruminating, Kalik launched himself towards the Nexus. Each moment of flight was nerve-wracking, with the Blue expecting to be pulled back into visions at the worst possible opportunity. When he had to fly over water, Calyx paid special attention to his protective spells. But to his relief and astonishment, the artifact permitted him to reach the Nexus unhindered. Calyx decided to try to focus on something other than the object of his nightmares. The Nexus's collection had to be organized, even if he had initially made the suggestion as an excuse, not because he had any true desire to take on the task. But he realized that before he could begin on the collection, he had to work on strengthening the wards. There was no chance that they would remain strong enough to protect the Nexus and its contents for very much longer, unless he attended to them now. He changed into his humanoid form, at the moment feeling oddly more comfortable in it than in his true one. Calyx summoned a simple marble stand with a fluted column and cautiously set the artifact atop the waist-high platform, then turned his attention to the wards. Shutting his eyes, he concentrated. Even with his eyes closed, the blue dragon could see the world around him, but it was a world crisscrossed with a variety of multicolored ley lines. All of Azeroth was draped in this complex arrangement of lines of magical energy, but those he currently viewed served a specific purpose. They powered the various wards that acted as the Nexus's protection. Following along the ley lines, he began to inspect each ward carefully. Calyx quickly saw the weakest of the wards. He put forth a hand in which, in this world view, glowed with lavender energy, and gestured at the ley line needed. With his other hand, he drew from another of Azeroth's ley lines and linked the two where the core of the first lay exposed. But before he could do more, the Nexus itself began to shimmer. Dismissing his spell work, Calyx opened his eyes and immediately looked to the artifact. Not at all to his surprise, it had taken on a different glow, this one matching the array of magical colors associated with the immense forces in and around the Nexus. The stronger the relic's glow, the less intense was that of Calyx's surroundings. That the artifact could have any effect on the Nexus stunned Calyx. It had done little when he had last brought it here, but then the artifact had not been whole before. The missing piece had not only magnified the whole artifact's abilities, but also possibly even stirred up other formerly dormant. Calyx grabbed the artifact and transformed. Planting it against his chest, the former aspect fled through the Nexus as quickly as he could. The energies of the Nexus continued to fluctuate as he raced through tunnel after tunnel, until at last he reached the exit. Once outside, Calyx soared high into the sky. Below him, he could make out the entirety of the Nexus. The dragon sensed the various energies in play in a manner of which he was entirely unfamiliar. Calyx, who should have understood better that most Calyx, who should have understood better than most the nature of such magical manipulation, could not fathom with what intent it was done. The rich colors normally reserved for the Nexus's forces now radiated strongly from the artifact. As for the Nexus, it abruptly flared bright again, so much so that the blue dragon was forced to look away or be blinded. And then the intense stirring of magical energy subsided. What Calyx expected to see when he glanced back at the Nexus, he could not say. What he did see both perplexed and surprised him. The Nexus looked and felt to him exactly as it had before. With a wary hiss, the dragon circled his sanctum once, seeking any change, however subtle. Despite his best efforts, Calyx still found no difference. All that could hardly be for nothing, he muttered to the infuriating object in his grip. What did you do? The relic, its glow once more normal, gave no clue. Snorting, the dragon dived back down to the gap through which he had emerged. As he entered, his gaze immediately went to the artifact. However, there was no change in the glow. Calyx returned to his chambers, expecting each moment that the foul thing would begin anew to wreak havoc. That there was no sign of it doing so did not assuage his fears in the least. While Kalik was aware that he might only be feeling paranoia, there was still the chance that the artifact might be up to something, even while apparently quiescent? It's not a word I'm very familiar with, I'm sorry. Determined more than ever to find some other relic that might help him combat the effects of the one he held. Kalik summoned forth an ancient piece in which he had particular hope. An oval crystal, a deep aquamarine hue, and the size of his paw materialized in the air before him. Kalik was not certain of all its properties, but some of the knowledge had been passed on to him, gave him the impression that it might nullify the magic of the octagonal relic. But the moment he touched the crystal, its rich hue faded. Kalik quickly probed the artifact. It was utterly devoid of any trace of magical energy. A curse that mixed well the best or worst of dragon, human, and dwarf escaped the Blue's mouth. Enraged at this latest so swift defeat, Kalik threw the octagonal antiquity without care what might happen. It flew with tremendous speed toward the wall, then came to a halt barely an inch from possible destruction. From there it descended to the floor without even a sound. The dragon roared. Unable to stop himself, Kalik unleashed a barrage of spells upon the relic. Fire sought to consume the piece. Bolts of arcane energy assailed it. A lance of ice attempted to pierce its surface. Lightning blasted it. And none of the attacks left the slightest scar upon it. His breathing ragged from the strain of his efforts, Kalik slumped. The artifact continued to glow faintly, again seeming to mock him. The blue dragon brooded for a while, then suddenly stiffened. Perhaps I've been going about this the wrong way. Kalik had never really tried to understand the artifact. From the start, he had seen it only as something evil. Yet now he wondered what purpose there could possibly be in driving him mad. Approaching the artifact, the dragon studied every bit of the exterior that he could not see without touching it, but he noticed no change. Another probe with his powers also yielded nothing new. Still, Kalik was not satisfied. The artifact could even at this moment be in the midst of some pre-planned spellwork that his acute senses could not detect. It had already proved itself capable of acting upon him without his noticing. He focused on the small addition he had found during his second excursion to the skeleton. Simple as it appeared, it was obviously an integral part of the overall relic. Thus far, it seemed to him that it had magnified the original effect, but he believed it also did more. A slight gleam in the center of the smaller piece caught his attention. The dragon squinted. A young human woman with long blonde hair stood before him, a woman he knew too well. There was an innocence about her, an innocence that drew him as much as her beauty. It's always a blonde. Anvina, the blue dragon gasped. He reached a paw to her, only to have it go through her own extended hand. Suddenly, Kalik stood in a forest. It was no longer a dragon, but rather a half-elven figure. It was the same form in which Kalik had first met Anvina. I don't know if they're going to explain who Anvina is, but she is the embodiment of the power of the Sunwell. This was introduced in a comic series of how they were going to restore the Sunwell, which was also added into the game. Now, if you do the raid for the Sunwell, at the end of it, you'll see her return to the Sunwell itself and purify it. That's who Anvina is. And she is the Sunwell turned into a sentient being of sorts. Kalik. Anvina faintly called, her outline becoming more faded in distance. She continued to extend her hand towards him as if beckoning him to join her. Kalik. He was jolted. The second calling of his name had not been done by Anvina, but by Jaina. It was enough to bring him back to consciousness. Kalik wrenched himself away from the artifact. He was covered in sweat. He also noticed that, as if in the dream, he had hands, not paws. At some point, Kalik had changed shape without even noticing it. At that moment, Kalik felt the presence of another blue dragon. Somehow, the knowledge that he was no longer alone in the Nexus enabled him to pull himself together. Whirling away from the artifact, Kalik left the chamber to see who had returned and why. It was not until he was nearly at one of the entrances that he saw movement. Kalik marched towards the newcomer without saying a word. The smaller blue dragon, female, had her back toward him. Kalik hesitated. Tiri? The female turned, but she was not the one who he had thought her to be. The former aspect silently berated himself for expecting to see the female blue to whom he had once been promised. The blue before him stared at Kalik as if seeing an orc. He recalled his transformation. Although they were creatures of magic, blues generally retained their dragon forms when in the Nexus. Spellweaver, she finally acknowledged. I thought you were away. This time ignoring the use of a title no longer his, Kalik resumed his draconic shape. Now peering down on her, Kalik could not help blurting, And you hope to be about your business and depart before I returned? She looked as aghast as a dragon could. No, no, Spellweaver. In truth, I am pleased that you are here. I wanted to tell you of an anomaly I sensed near the Dragonblight recently, very near Warmrest Temple. Kalik knew immediately that she referred to the artifact stirring. I know about it. There's nothing to concern yourself about. The female looked slightly embarrassed. I should have known you'd be aware of it. That should have been the end of it, but the other blue dragon simply remained where she was, looking vastly uncomfortable. Kalik made an assumption about what ran through her mind. I'm grateful for your concern. You were on your way somewhere else, though, weren't you? Yes, I thought I would explore. He let her get no further. Then by all means you should continue on. Again, you have my thanks for coming back to give warning. She gave him another uncomfortable look, then bowing her head, departed. See, the blue dragons have a bit of an issue where they kind of become solitary after a while. They kind of get wrapped up in their own little magical business. And for any of them to actually stay around and talk to each other or anything is kind of a rarity. You saw that in Dragonblight when Kalik was trying to reform the Blue Dragonflight so that their Oathstone could be empowered again. But for the most part, most of them were either like, Kalik is just an upstart and he's not anything and he's not going to be the Spellweaver or anything like that. And then there's others that are like, I'm just doing my own business, please leave me alone. There were only a few blue dragons that we saw, like in Legion, where they actually had a whole family and they actually stuck together. Those were the Azure dragons. With the big blue grandfather that we got to see pass on to his next life, which was a very beautiful scene. Kalik paused in thought for a moment and turned from the entrance, just in time to catch a glimpse of a shadowed figure the size of a night elf or a tall human in the darkened passage from which he had only just come. The dragon surged forward, moving with more than enough swiftness to catch up with any intruder. However, even though he reached an area where the long passage would have prevented anyone from hiding or escaping into a side tunnel, there was no one. Kalik probed the area with magic, but there was definitely no trace of another. Only as that knowledge sank in did the blue also see better in his mind just what that intruder had looked like beyond his mere height. The image that formed made Kalik certain that his sanity was indeed crumbling, and crumbling fast. It was the same cloaked and hooded figure from the visions. Kalik did not try to deny what he had seen. It had been either the product of his overstressed imagination or some new facet of the artifact's magic. Neither was a pleasant alternative. The first was an indication of just how unstable he might already be. If it was the second, it meant that the accursed object had likely had some new game it wished to play with him. He chose to consider it the latter and immediately raced back to where he had left the relic. Unfortunately, the darkness caught him first, sending the blue tumbling against the passage walls, as great fragments of stone showered Kalik. The dragon, already barely conscious, pitched forward halfway into his sanctum. But even before his body struck the floor, his mind found itself soaring in the sky. Kalik was once again a part of Malagos, but this was a Malagos much more subdued, much more driven. In the distance, a thundering roar that could only have erupted from the jaws of Galakrond shook Kalik and his host. Fortunately, as the roar trailed off, its fading made it evident that the gargantuan proto-dragon was headed in a different direction. Malagos pushed on, his thoughts so buried by his urgency that Kalik had trouble ferreting anything out. Kalik saw glimpses of Alexstrasza and Ysera, a handful of proto-dragons of the same family as Malagos, and flashes of Neltharion fighting something that was too small to be Galakrond. After much delving, Kalik discovered that at least one of the memories involved Malagos staving off an undead proto-dragon with fading red coloring. Kalik remembered the early struggle and knew that there had been no red proto-dragon other than Alexstrasza. For a moment he feared that she had perished at some point and risen as an undead, as other corpses had, but then he realized that could obviously not be the case. Yet, even if the undead proto-dragon had not been Alexstrasza, it still meant that once again the dread had risen. Kalik did not know why, but he was certain that somehow the answer could be found with Galakrond. It was something he sensed a moment later that Malagos also believed. Indeed, Kalik finally learned that Malagos had only just fled from the undead. There had been more than the one. There had been 7. Worse, Malagos had not been alone. He had been accompanied by 2 of his proto-dragon family. They had not escaped. Guilt washed over Malagos, and Kalik understood that he felt he should have stayed. Yet it was clear from what glimpses Kalik had of his host's memories that Malagos had only fled after the other 2 had been lost entirely. Curiously, and most worrying to Kalik, his host had blocked out all thought of just how the other 2 had perished. There was no sign of any other proto-dragon along Malagos's path. While that meant little to Kalik at first, he gradually sensed Malagos's concern about this point. It was with relief to both that another winged figure came into view a few minutes later. Neltharion still radiated a bit of bluster, but even he watched the air around them with the utmost caution. "Friend Malagos! Ha! You did come! We survive! We are hunters!" Despite his bravado, Neltharion's tone hinted at relief that Malagos still lived. Kalik wondered how many others had not survived. "What is going on here?" Kalik asked, although, of course, no one could hear him. Dragon legends said nothing of this evidently critical time period for the proto-dragons. The age of the dragons had yet to come, but with Malagos and the other future aspects alive, That shift from proto-dragon to dragon dominance had to be imminent. Yet what Kalik had witnessed thus far pointed towards extinction for all. Even a true dragon could not stand against the horror like Galakrond. The others? Queried Malagos. The fire one, she as well. The little sister, she barks much. Neltharion paused, then less brashly added, Zorix. He was taken. In Malagos's mind there appeared the image of a male proto-dragon with darting eyes and a shining golden hide. Even though Kalik had not seen this male before, both Malagos and Neltharion apparently had known him for part of whatever period of time had passed since the last vision. His loss disturbed the blue hosts immensely. Talanixa speaks as him. Talanixa speaks too well as him. Of this Talanixa, Kalik only sensed that she had been Zorix's mate and was a female proto-dragon of strong will. Among those proto-dragons who had made the sudden leap to intelligence, she was evidently considered one of the most cunning. But for all that apparent cunning, Kalik's host did not have the greatest trust in Talanixa. It had nothing to do with her being a female. Alexstrasza's quick wits and courage had already raised... Whoops. My pages flipped too much. Alexstrasza's quick wits and courage had already raised her high in Malagos's eyes, but he considered other aspects of her manner dangerous. More, Kalik could not divine at the moment. Neltharion's eyes narrowed. He looked past Malagos. The other proto-dragon quickly followed his companion's gaze, but saw only empty sky. The gray male exhaled. Nothing. Not him. Not them. A shudder ran through Malagos, but Kalik's host blocked out all thought of what caused it. The others gather? Yes. Follow. Both proto-dragons flew hard and fast, as if Galakrond himself snapped at their tails. Kalik became caught up in their urgency, even though he knew only half of what happened at most. Malagos continually glanced around, often focusing on the ground far below. Gradually, Kalik understood what bothered Malagos about the landscape. It was devoid of any visible animal life except for a few birds. No large beasts roamed any of the places over which the proto-dragons flew. Eyeing Neltharion, Malagos asked, We are close? More to fly. Other roost fell. It took Kalik a moment to decipher the last. Whatever previous site the proto-dragons had chosen to gather at had become too dangerous. They had been forced to move farther on. A rumble from some distance behind stirred up both flyers. The gray proto-dragon glanced back. Malagos instinctively followed suit. There was no sign of Galakrond, but even Kalik was aware that the gigantic fiend could cover tremendous distances in a blink of an eye. Hissing in frustration, Malagos started to turn his gaze back to the path ahead. 4 winged forms coming from the north caught his attention. Eyes narrowed, Malagos studied the oncoming proto-dragons. Others, he warned Neltharion. His companion stared at the newcomers. No one is north. North is bad. Malagos hissed again. Yes. The 4 proto-dragons drew near enough for some details to become evident. To Kalik's relief, though, they were not what he expected. These were living, breathing proto-dragons. But Malagos was not at all pleased, and Kalik quickly saw why. At the head of the formation flew a familiar blue-green proto-dragon, Koros. Kalik also recognized one of the others who had joined in the first attack on Malagos. With a sneer at the 4, Neltharion rumbled, This fight I like. To both the Greys and Kalik's surprise, and Malagos shook his head. We fight the not living. We fight Galakrond, not one another. Koros know that? The other proto-dragons slowed as they approached the pair. Koros surveyed Malagos and Neltharion. You live. good. Yes, returned Kellick's host calmly. We live, and that is good. Koros also lives, and that is good too. No fights between us. Fight only Galakrond, yes? Malagos's rival dipped his head as if in taking the sentiment to heart. The sly grin ever remained in place, though. Both knew that the only dire circumstances kept them from concluding their bloody feud. The North is not good, interjected an impatient Neltharion. He looked disappointed that there would not be a fight. Koros should not be north. We scout, Telenisa asked. Telenisa? Malagos repeated with some trepidation. Why? Telenisa plans. The icy blue male refrained from snorting, although it took a struggle to do so. Kalik felt Malagos's growing concern over the female's overwhelming command of the other proto-dragons. Talenisa's kind were headstrong, impulsive, but also dominating. It was not a combination for which either Malagos nor Kalik cared, especially now. The North, Malagos finally said. Danger? To Kalik, who could do nothing but observe, the grin only grew slyer. No danger. Koros too clever for stupid non-living. This was not the first time Kalik had heard the unsettling term used, and despite his own predicament, that concerned him. How many of these moving corpses are there? How many? More important, Kalik wondered just how they had come into being. In his own time, he lived in a world where, with the exception of the Forsaken, who had sworn their allegiance to the Horde, the undead were a not uncommon menace, destroyed on sight whenever possible. Yet in such an early era in Azeroth's history, he had hardly expected to hear of such horrors. Too much talk, Neltharion growled. We all go. Koros did not argue, instead immediately veered past the duo. His comrades, all the same family, followed without any further glance at the Grey or Malagos. We fight faster? Neltharion quietly asked Kalik's host. Malagos nodded. Yes, faster. And with that, they shot past at a startled Koros and the rest. As Malagos pushed, he and Kalik heard Koros' angry hiss. Kalik was not at all surprised to see that proto-dragons share more than one trait with dragons. Among dragons, racing had always been a popular competition. Malagos peered over his shoulder to see Koros and the others trying their best to catch up. However, Malagos and Neltharion set an astounding pace. Kalik could scarcely believe his host still had such strength, then sensed that Malagos had embraced the suggestion not only because of his disdain for Koros, but also for that short time, the blue and white male could focus less on the horrors unleashed upon his world. Despite the strain, Malagos continued to fly right alongside Neltharion and several lengths ahead of his rival. Try as he might, Koros could not catch up, although he did soon leave his other companions far behind. It occurred to Kalik only too late that, spread out as they were, the 6 proto-dragons made a much more visible target, but fortunately nothing happened. Still, he felt Malagos also relieved to arrive finally at the bowl-shaped valley, where in the shadows it soon became apparent that scores upon scores of proto-dragons warily gathered. The valley echoed with hisses as the newcomers descended, but not all of the reactions focused on the arrivals. There were members of nearly every proto-dragon family of which Malagos was aware, plus a few that Kalik's host did not recognize. Many were not by nature or by attitude on friendly terms with one another. Only the disaster sweeping over their world would force them to now at least pretend to be allies. They say that they gathered in some a bowl-shaped valley, and I'm thinking that's Ongoro Crater, which I'm pretty sure that's where they were first created, these dragons. So The tension was also magnified by the presence of many of the lesser, as Malagos thought of them, proto-dragons, those that were essentially little more than animals. They had to be constantly herded or guarded by their more intelligent brethren. For Kalek, it set into stark relief the curious rise of those of Malagos's generation. A throaty, harsh hiss rose above the din. It cut off the rest. Malagos followed the hiss to its source. Telenisa dominated not only in voice but also in size and presence. She was a third again as large as most of the males, only a few such as Neltharion outweighing her. Her smooth hide glittered gold even under the overcast sky. Telenisa had sharp gleaming black eyes that, when fixed upon individual proto-dragons, subdued even the most restive. Malagos and Neltharion moved to where Alexstrasza and Ysera perched. Unlike many of the other proto-dragons, the sisters had kept to themselves and not their family. Some of Malagos's family stared at his choice of companions, but there seemed no surprise on the part of Neltharion's family that he chose such odd friends. In fact, Kalek thought that its members looked a little relieved not to have to concern themselves with the brash gray. Koros alighted a short distance to Talanix's left. He was obviously out of breath, but did his best to pretend he was as calm as Malagos. "More have come," Talanixa roared. "We are many! Say it! We are many!" A chorus of proto-dragon voices repeated her litany over and over. Kalek shared Malagos's frustration with the proto-dragons now risking their hiding places. They followed Talanix's lead. Strength was important, but common sense was something obviously not shared by all. "She talks fighting," Ysera muttered. "Not good. Peace is better." Though looking as disappointed as her sister, Alexstrasza disagreed. "We must fight, but not fight like Talanixa. We fight, we die." As the two females argued, Koros slid up to Talanixa and whispered to her. This snared Malagos's attention. He strained to hear anything but could not. Kalek was also frustrated. He did not trust Koros any more than his host did. Talanixa listened intently, then dismissed Koros with a short hiss. He moved back to his previous position, seeming satisfied with whatever he had passed on to the larger proto-dragon. "North is empty," she proclaimed. "No, not living. Galakron's trail is also found." Most of the other proto-dragons welcomed this news with nods and low hisses. Yet there were several who did not take the information with much pleasure. Malagos radiated a certain satisfaction with this as he studied some of the hesitant ones. He focused on one in particular, but it was Kalek who first recognized the male with the coarse brown hide as the one who had aided both Malagos and Neltharion during the confrontation with Galakron. The brown male looked particularly perturbed by Talanix's declarations and the other proto-dragon's willing submission to her. He turned away only to meet Malagos's gaze. Talanixa spoke again. "We fight soon. We gather more. Find others. There are others. Go! Come again with all when the moon's around." If the gathering appeared to end abruptly to Kalek, he quickly learned through Malagos that such a coming together of proto-dragons was uncommon in the first place, and it was a sign of both the magnitude of the threat and Talanix's influence that this many had showed up so soon. Indeed, even despite danger to all of them, several of the proto-dragons looked relieved to depart. Others went about the task of guiding their bestial brethren away, a scene that once more stirred Kalek's curiosity about the odd transformation overtaking the proto-dragons. A transformation with little future unless they could somehow bring down the voracious behemoth in their midst. Malagos watched with veiled eyes what Koros did. Unlike the others, he remained near Talanixa. As she herself ready to fly, the blue-green male slid up next to her and spoke. Unwilling to trust his rival's influence on the situation, Malagos started for the pair, only to have Neltharion insert himself between Kalek's host and the duo. friend in Malagos, that Brown. You see him? Koros glanced their way. The rival male sneered. Talanixa took that moment to fly off. Koros, now bereft of the subject of his attention, did the same a breath later. Hiding his annoyance, Malagos turned his attention to the brown proto-dragon. The world swam. Kalik briefly slipped into darkness, but if he had hoped that this presaged a return to his own time, his own body, he was sorely disappointed. Malagos flew alone again, the proto-dragon warier than ever. Thanks to images flashing through Malagos's mind, Kalik quickly understood why. The proto-dragon flew over lands to the east, where there had been several sightings of the not-living. However, as with many other things in previous visions, the exact reason why Malagos was scouting on his own was not so apparent. As with the last area the proto-dragon had flown over, the landscape below appeared empty of animal life. However, in this bleak place, neither Kalik nor his host had expected to see many beasts. Still, Kalik gathered that Malagos had seen absolutely nothing. Alighting on a slow peak, Malagos peered around. More thoughts crept through Kalik's mind, filling it in some missing pieces. Malagos sought the reason for Galakron's frightful transformation into this hungry fiend, terrorizing all, and he sought it very near where the behemoth kept his lair. Kalik questioned the sanity of what Malagos desired, but he had no choice but to hope that Galakron was far, far away. Malagos believed that to be the case, but both were aware that there was a chance he was wrong. Malagos's heart pounded from tension as the proto-dragon drew near to where the lair was presumed to be. The peaks there were so tall it seemed that they were trying to touch the cloud-enshrouded sun. Such giant mountains would likely to provide caverns large enough to house a monster the size of Galakron. Something below caught Malagos's attention. He dived toward it. At first, Kalik only saw a rock, but then he realized that a portion of that rock was of a disquieting and familiar color. The bones had lain there for some time, possibly 4 or 5 seasons. Those that were visibly indicated a beast as large as many proto-dragons, or as Malagos discovered after scraping away the earth from one area, it was an actual proto-dragon. This one had perished violently. Many of the bones were cracked, and the partial skull that verified just what lay there had been crushed by a tremendous force. Galakron, Kalik knew. Here was an early victim. While to him it only served to show just how long Galakron had been on his murderous rampage, Malagos evidently saw something more in the bones. Although no one had witnessed how Galakron reduced some of his victims to emaciated corpses that would rise as parasitic undead, the evidence of their existence was without question after Malagos's battles. Yet Kalik now wondered if this was one of the Leviathan's prey, why had it not transformed as the others had? Silence reigned about them, but something made Malagos look to his right. To Kalik's observation, there was nothing to be seen. Even a proto-dragon as courageous as Malagos could not be blamed for being jumpy under such conditions. Returning to the bones, Malagos nudged a few around. With little exception, they revealed that Galakron had ripped apart and chewed up this unfortunate creature. Malagos's memories of a much smaller but still imposing Galakron briefly arose, giving Kalik a startled glimpse of how the latter had changed. Galakron, as seen in the earlier stages, had looked much more like a normal proto-dragon and not nearly large enough to swallow others whole. His body also had a smoother, streamlined appearance. His coloring had been more muted, and the eyes had not had that incessant, hungering look to them. Malagos continued to ferret around amongst the bones, seeking clues. It was yet another hint, not the Kalik needed one, of how intricate his host's thinking was compared with that of the other proto-dragons. Somehow he survived, a disembodied blue thought. Somehow, some of them survived. But how? The proto-dragon tensed again. This time, Malagos looked skyward. To the east, a shape already far too massive to be a normal proto-dragon raced towards the mountains at Malagos's position. The mountains were too far away for Malagos to reach before he would be seen. Calyx's host had no choice but to flatten himself out where he was. His coloring did not blend with the land, but he hoped that Galakrond would not fly near enough to notice. A constant heavy beat preceded Galakrond, the sound of his vast wings flapping. Malagos knew that with each beat, the gigantic proto-dragon crossed miles. The beat grew louder, closer. Malagos and Kalik knew that Galakrond was almost upon them. But then the beat began to recede. Through narrowed eyes, Malagos watched Galakrond head away from him and towards the mountains. However, just as the icy blue proto-dragon dared draw a new breath, Galakrond halted. Hovering, the behemoth suddenly began heaving as if choking on something. Neither Malagos nor Kalik paid much mind at first to whatever assailed Galakrond, the giant creature's physical appearance drawing their initial attention. Although it could not have been that long since the vision in which they had previously encountered Galakrond, Kalik was especially stunned by how much more misshapen the fiend had become. Not only was Galakrond oddly distorted, but he now had several growths randomly dotting his body. There were also a number of gray splotches that made it seem as if parts of Galakrond were decaying. But just as Malagos and Kalik came to grips with this new deformed Galakrond, the monster disgorged what had caused him such distress. Bodies. More than a score of shriveled, limp proto-dragon bodies. They dropped in a horrendous heap to the ground, some flopping about as they struck. Malagos radiated immense distress at the sight, not only because of the awful slaughter, but also because among the limp forms he saw red, brown, gray, and even greenish-yellow bodies. Kalik wished at that moment that he could throw up. In all his life never had he, who had seen so much horror, witnessed something that struck him in such a nightmarish manner. He could imagine the final throes of each and every victim and knew that so many more had perished the same way. He suddenly felt Malagos's further fear upon seeing this grisly image. Alexstrasza, Ysera, and Neltharion were also in the region, and from a distance Malagos could not tell whether the other three were among the corpses. Even though Kalik knew that all three had survived this era, he could not help but pick up his host's growing worry. With one last purge, Galakrond finished. The gigantic proto-dragon immediately turned away, then took to the air again. As sharp as they were, Malagos's eyes could still not make out any detail on the odd growths marking Galakrond's body. Whether they had something to do with the behemoth's madness, neither observer could say, but Malagos at least wanted to see them better. Yet Kalik's host was not foolhardy. He waited as Galakrond soared away, watching until the fiend had long vanished into the distance. Only after that did Malagos dare begin to rise, and then he just instinctively dropped one more as three other proto-dragons flew in the direction from which Galakrond had originally come. Why exactly Malagos had chosen to hide rather than rise and warn the trio was something Kalik sensed that even his host did not quite understand himself. However, as the three neared, their coloring gave hint that perhaps Malagos had taken the wise course. The three blue-green proto-dragons soared over the landscape as if undeterred by the potential for disaster. Malagos watched as they neared where Galakrond had last paused. At that point, not all to his surprise, he recognized Koros as the leader. One of the other proto-dragons caught sight of the macabre remnants of Galakrond's last meal. He immediately hissed to Koros. Why am I saying it was Kronos? Koros led the descent to the corpses. He alighted near one, studied a few of the bodies for a moment, then glanced in the direction in which the murderous Leviathan had headed. With a hiss, Koros rose into the air and headed the same way. His two companions followed. Malagos and Kalik watched in disbelief as the trio raced after Galacrond. Koros did not strike Kalik as suicidal, and Malagos' own thoughts mirrored agreement. Yet neither could fathom any sane reason for Koros to risk himself to such an extent. If he was simply spying on Galacrond, he was doing so in a far more reckless manner than Malagos. Rising, Kalik's host stared at the vanishing figures. Malagos did not know whether to warn the three or leave them to their doom. Past animosities paled at the moment, Malagos not wishing even Koros a fate such as these other pro-dragons had. A ragged hiss erupted from the pile of corpses. Malagos forgot all about Galacron and Koros as he turned toward the nearby carnage. The first thought flashing through the proto-dragon's mind was that one of the victims had survived. Malagos started toward the bodies, trying to locate the right one. As he neared, another ragged hiss arose from a different direction. Malagos halted, looking there. A third hiss came from yet another location. Several of the victims began to push up. Heads turned almost as one to stare at Kalik's host. Stare, with the empty eyes of the undead. Malagos retreated, the icy blue proto-dragon already flapping his wings for flight. Unfortunately, he failed to see one of the undead creatures rising to his right. Its hiss was his only warning. A foul mist exhaled by the undead touched his wing. Malagos roared as he felt a coldness that even he could not stand burn deep into his body. Despite his agony, Malagos exhaled and turned. Frost covered the attacking creature, but whereas it would have stiffened many an adversary, it only slowed the undead. Still, that gave Kalik's host just enough time to leap into the air. Ignoring the pain, he pushed higher and higher. The chorus of nerve-wracking hisses below gave warning that several of the undead were giving swift pursuit. Despite Kalik wishing desperately that the proto-dragon would look down to see how close they were, Malagos kept focused on his ascent. He flew on, seeking the clouds above. Kalik finally understood that his host hoped to evade the winged horrors by losing them in the murkiness of the clouds. Malagos did not breathe easier even upon attaining cover. He veered sharply to his left, then after a short distance flew level. Behind him, the hisses of the undead spread throughout the clouds. Some sounded farther and farther away, but others still hinted of pursuers yet on his trail. Malagos kept his jaws clamped tight, breathing through his nostrils as best he could. Any sound, even exhalation, might prove enough to catch the attention of the undead. Kalik, forced to accept whatever decision his host made, remained impressed with the proto-dragon's intelligence. Despite everything, this Malagos was very much the Malagos who had ruled so wisely for so long. This was the Malagos whom a young Kalik and every other blue dragon had looked up to in admiration. And yet he is still a proto-dragon, Kalik reminded himself. How can this be? How can... Another hiss arose from in front of Malagos. The pale red corpse collided with Kalik's host. The stench of decay poured over Malagos as the undead proto-dragon hissed in his face. Up close, bits of the skull could be seen through the areas where shreds of dry flesh has fallen away. One eye had sunken in. Teeth dripping with a thick mucus snapped at Malagos's throat. Taw's claws tore at Kalik's host, ripping through scale. Malagos lunged, seizing the undead's lower jaw in his teeth. With one powerful bite, the proto-dragon ripped the jaw loose. A thick black fluid that had once been blood spilled out of the ragged wound. The creature did not falter, but loss of the jaw prevented one source of danger to Malagos. Calyx's host spit out the rotting piece, then quickly exhaled into the exposed throat. The icy mist poured into the undead, freezing the insides. Malagos's foe contorted. It released its hold on him. Malagos whipped his tail forward, striking the frozen torso. The undead shattered, the top and bottom halves falling in separate directions. The winged upper half remained aloft for a moment, then even the pretense of life faded, and the remains dropped out of view below. But from much too nearby came more hisses, indications that several of the other undead had been drawn by the commotion. The taste of decaying flesh still on his tongue, Malagos pushed forward. Another of the animated corpses materialized from the murky clouds blocking his path. Malagos attempted to arc past it, only to have a second come from him from that direction. Calyx's host immediately stopped flapping. He dropped like a stone, falling beneath the two undead. But as he broke through the bottom of the cloud cover, Malagos discovered he had escaped two to fall into the midst of four. The empty, hungering faces surrounded him, for the first time causing Malagos to lose hope. "No! Do something!" Calyx silently roared to no avail. "Do something!" Two of the unliving monsters lunged at Malagos, who managed to evade only one. The second seized his left forearm and wing, snaring Malagos thoroughly. The other three fell upon him. Malagos exhaled on the one holding him. Again, the ice only slowed, not stilled the undead. And even though none of the four moved with the smooth swiftness of the living proto-dragon, they had him caught. Calyx felt the certainty of death, or worse, creep into Malagos's thoughts, even as the proto-dragon continued to struggle. Then a hard blast of what seemed like sand caught the foremost fiend in the back. The sand struck with such intensity that the shriveled, dry body cracked in two. The undead proto-dragon twitched wildly as it still sought to keep hold of Malagos. There came a ferocious roar from another direction, one so thundering that at first Calyx and his host both thought that Galakrond had come upon the scene. But the roar was followed by Neltharion's familiar laugh as he ripped into the side of one of the other clinging corpses. The next nearest corpse turned to attack Neltharion, but again a blast of sand shot forth, battering the undead so hard that the creature was sent tumbling away. The blast was followed by a brown form that caught the whirling corpse at the throat and bit through the bone and scale with such force that he nearly severed the head from the torso. The body fluttered around aimlessly, heading off in one direction as the newcomer spat out the other remnants with as much obvious distaste as Malagos had earlier displayed. With only the fiend with the broken back and one other foe, Calyx's host was better able to defend himself. He grabbed the grasping hindpaw of the ruined creature and thrust it at the second undead proto-dragon. The paw instinctively seized the wing of Malagos's other attacker, giving the icy blue male an opening as his foremost opponent struggled to pull free. This time, Malagos breathed upon the wings of his broken attacker, exhaling until he had no breath left whatsoever. Vertigo almost overtook Calyx's host, but the proto-dragon fought to stay conscious. Frozen stiff and heavily laden with ice, the wings pulled the one undead down. The second creature, still clutched by the first, also dropped, unfortunately in the process taking Malagos along with both. As the three of them fell, Malagos bit at the arm of the second fiend, fighting through the bone as quickly as he could. Past the hissing countenance of one undead, the proto-dragon and Calyx saw the ground rushing up. The bone finally cracked, as did one of Malagos's teeth. The pain was a momentary annoyance compared to what could happen if he did not finish biting through the limb. Calyx's host clamped down and the last of the bone gave way. Beating hard, Malagos kicked at his foremost foe as he pushed skyward. With a horrendous ripping sound, the last muscles and tendons separated, enabling him to escape the two undead. The animated corpses crashed into the rocky landscape, the collision so intense that both dry forms shattered, sending bits scattering in several directions. By that time, Malagos, the remaining paw finally removed from him and tossed aside, was well into the sky again. And there Malagos beheld not only Neltharion and the brown male whom he and Kalik had noted at Talanix's gathering, but also Alexstrasza and Ysera. The sisters hovered at opposite ends of the area where the males finished their macabre adversaries. The females kept wary watch for more threats. Neltharion was in the process of tearing to shreds the creature he fought. Of the brown foe, there was no sign. Oh, I read that wrong. Of the brown's foe, there was no sign, which could only mean that the newcomer had readily dispatched the undead. As Malagos neared, Neltharion let the last fragments of his opponent fall away. Of the group, only the charcoal gray male looked cheerful. Ha! We have won! We can still lose, the brown reminded him with a hint of impatience. Many more not living near. Alexstrasza and Ysera joined the trio. We see nothing, the yellow female muttered. Nothing but death. Her sister hissed at her, but Ysera looked undaunted. Through Malagos, Kalik learned that Ysera was one of the belief that there was still a way to achieve peace with Galakrond. She was not the only one, either. Malagos eyed the brown male. I know you. The other dipped his head. Nos dormu. Fight well. Neltharion chuckled. Fights almost as well as me. Nos dormu's smile was very brief. Many not living. Why here? Why now? It became apparent to both Kalik and his host that none of the rest had witnessed anything akin to what Malagos had experienced earlier. Nor had anyone evidently seen Koros seemingly fly after Galakrond. For the moment, Malagos chose not to mention the latter incident, the ghastly sight he had seen before that obviously of much more importance. As clever as he was, Malagos was still a proto-dragon. The words he needed to explain properly what he had seen Galakrond do with his victims were hard to put together, especially with danger still close at hand. So bound to Malagos was he that Kalik not only felt the proto-dragon's frustrations, but also wished that he could speak for him. Through halting words, Malagos did his best. His descriptions were short, but raw emotion filled in many gaps, enhancing his tale. He left the other proto-dragons shocked, even Neltharion. No one disbelieved him, all understanding that Malagos was to be trusted. How? Alexstrasza demanded with much consternation. How? What has happened with Galakrond? Malagos thought he understood. Galakrond must eat much. Galakrond could not find enough. He grew hungry. Too hungry. Ate one of us. Although to Kalik such an act might have once seemed not so shocking, these were proto-dragons, creatures that he had thought simple brutes. He saw that they had boundaries much like those of dragons. The proto-dragons might fight to the death against one another, but they did not eat their foes. No matter their savagery, this concept revolted them. Even though they had witnessed Galakrond committing the heinous acts on a grand scale, they still did not want to accept it. Was hungry, Neltharion snarled, his generally cheerful demeanor at last broken by what they were discussing. Ate one of us. Why eat more? Grazers came north. More food. You saw Galakrond eat. Enough food now. Why still do this? Malagos shook his head. No one else had an answer either. There came more hisses. The proto-dragons glanced toward the sound. The hisses were still far away, but seemed to be getting nearer. We leave, Alexstrasza decided. Now! There was no protest, not even from Neltharion. They had no idea of how many of the unliving might attack next. Malagos's discovery of how the unliving came to be had altered everything. Malagos instinctively took point. Calyx's world turned upside down, and despite trying to prepare himself for it this time, the dragon blacked out. As ever, the darkness passed swiftly, although in this case only a brief passage of time, not return to a reality, occurred. The proto-dragons were on the attack, Talanixa leading the charge. Some of the proto-dragons, representing nearly all the families with which Calyx's host was familiar, dived into the fray. Their enemy was not Galacrond, however, but several undead. Where Malagos and his companions had a disadvantage in numbers, the opposite was true now. The proto-dragons faced perhaps a dozen of the animated corpses, which Kalik immediately understood had been purposely drawn to the deep canyon in which this battle played out. Through Malagos, Kalik caught a glimpse of Ysera, and also knew that Alexstrasza and Neltharion were part of the effort. Nosdormu had refused to be part of it, although not out of any cowardice. Malagos did not know where he was, and at the moment had no time to care. Outnumbered the horrors might be, but they still dealt death. The first to learn that terrible fact was an impetuous fire-orange female appearing some seasons older than Alexstrasza. One of the initial attackers, she fell upon a smaller undead, once a proto-dragon just out of its juvenile years. However, although the prey looked easy and Malagos had been among those offering a warning about the dangers of their enemy, she left herself open to the undead's breath. The dark, noxious cloud draped over the female's head and wings. She shrugged it off, then opened her mouth to unleash her only blast. But suddenly the brilliant colors of her scales faded wherever the cloud had touched. The flesh withered and the skin flaked away. Instead of exhaling a mighty blast at the fiend, the female let out a rasping cry as her eyes glazed over. And as Malagos and Kalik watched, briefly mesmerized, the scale and flesh fell away in the blink of an eye. The exposed skull, the jaws still open, cracked off and dropped out of sight. The torso, the ruined wings feebly flapping, followed. Above, Talanixa roared in anger at the proto-dragon's fatal error. Leading another of her family, she dropped upon the small undead and ripped it apart through the back. For good measure, the imposing female bit off the head and spat it toward one of the other flying corpses. Kill, like that! No more fools! Her advice, based in great part on information Malagos and Neltharion had relayed prior to this assault, served the rest well. Acting in teams of as many as 5, the proto-dragons tore into the remaining not living. One corpse was torn apart in short order, another burned to a crisp. There were still fatalities despite Talanix's insistence, fatalities that Malagos had expected and believed could have been avoided. Emaciated they might be, but the undead nonetheless had surprising physical strength and an unnatural tenacity. Moreover, they did not have to inhale trying to unleash their horrific clouds of decay. That dire fact was discovered by 2 proto-dragons who assumed that they were safe after avoiding the initial blasts. Their still twitching, decomposing bodies spiraled to the distant ground below. Yet another attacker might have suffered the same ghastly fate, if not for Neltharion dropping down on the undead just as it was about to unleash a blast. The future Deathwing seized the corpse's head with both hindpaws and ripped it clean off. A small gush of the deadly gas poured forth from the open neck, but touched no one. The charcoal gray proto-dragon roared with laughter as he tossed away the head and began to rip into the torso, which continued to fly in a haphazard circle. Malagos shook his head at his friend's enthusiasm. For Calyx's host, the sooner this ended, the better. He had no love for what they were doing. Like Alexstrasza and Ysera, Malagos still saw the living in the faces of these abominations. These were victims too. They had to be destroyed, but there was little reason to take joy in the effort. Talanixa struck the last blow, exhaling hard at a lone undead. The bolt of lightning she unleashed set the dry flesh ablaze. The animated corpse managed to stay aloft, but a second bolt shattered the already crumbling body, sending ashes scattering everywhere. With the destruction of her foes, the huge golden female roared triumphantly. Her cry was taken up by many of the others, causing Malagos to wince as he thought of how loud they were. It had been in part their cries that were used in the first place to help lure these non-living creatures to them. Malagos marveled that Telenixa and her supporters did not think this through, but he knew better than to try to speak the truth. Telenixa did not abide those who did not agree with her, and had already scarred a copper male in the face for questioning her. She also had several zealous followers willing to do worse to any other naysayers. For now, the sisters, Notharian and Calyx's host, were going along with Telenixa's decisions while they argued over what better choice to make. What that choice might be, none of them had yet been able to suggest, and all knew that time was quickly running out. Calyx could also see the disaster looming and did not think this brief triumph foreshadowed the same against Galakron any more than Malagos did. Calyx silently railed at his own defenselessness in the matter, and at the moment he realized that he felt more attuned to these ancient events than to his own troubles in the present. This is not right, Calyx thought. This is a reflection of the past. It's done. The future is the only battle left to be fought. But still, Calyx felt as much a part of this small band of proto-dragons as Malagos was. When Alexstrasza and Ysera spoke to his host, it was as if they spoke to Calyx. Even more surprising, when Notharian stood at Malagos' side, fighting along with him as any true friend and comrade would, Calyx experienced the same kinship Malagos had developed with the charcoal gray male. Kinship with Deathwing, and through a host who would someday become almost as much of a threat to Azeroth. The notion shook Calyx, and he railed anew at what happened to him, hoping that somehow he could return to his own time and body. Young Malagos, ever ignorant of Calyx's plight, was more concerned with his friend. He noticed Ysera rapidly descending into the canyon, her flight path somewhat erratic. Seeing no sign of Alexstrasza, Malagos chose to follow the yellowish female himself. With what was obvious effort, Ysera alighted just a few yards above the bottom. The scorched, torn remnants of undead lay scattered below her. As Malagos dropped near her, he saw that Ysera's breathing had become labored. With Malagos, Calyx, his own distress momentarily forgotten, shared his host's concern for the other proto-dragon. Ysera did not notice Malagos until he was almost upon her. Even then, she only looked up at him with sullen eyes, then continued her efforts to regain her breath. The icy male landed beside her but did not speak. Observing Ysera, Malagos noted her gaze drifting from one ripped piece of dry flesh to another. Neither Malagos nor Calyx could make sense of her observations. The fragments were from a variety of families, including both Malagos's and Notharian's, but not, upon closer inspection, Ysera's. "Not here," she finally murmured as her breathing calmed. "Not here." After a moment, Malagos asked, "Who?" "Drowlad." The name meant nothing to either Calyx or his host. Malagos waited, and both were rewarded a few breaths later as Ysera clarified. "Clutch, brother." Malagos hissed low, then muttered, "He is dead." These were, too. That had occurred to both Malagos and Calyx, but not what Ysera was implying. "Saw a body?" Malagos offered. She looked up at the male, her gaze steady and demanding. "Not burned by my sister. You destroyed it?" Malagos shook his head. There had been no thought of destroying the dead at that point. Even though this generation had seen proto-dragons leap to a level of intelligence far in advance of anything they had developed before, The notion of a proper burial was not something the creatures had yet conceived. Even dragons, Kalik knew, simply preferred to come to their final rest near the temple, and oddly, near Galakrond. Watched every nun living, Ysera went on, stretching her wings. She looked recovered from her bout, although she was still somewhat weary. Not found. Not found. His body. Not there, the female snapped. Then, looking more tired again, she shrugged off the conversation and took it to the air. Kalik's host watched as she ascended. What he recalled of that discovery had made him believe that Ysera's clutch brother had not risen as so many others had. Other early victims had remained dead. Alexstrasza had no doubt said something to that effect to her sister, but Ysera's own search and its lack of success bothered Malygos and Kalik. Was it possible that the older dead were also rising? If so, then the threat to the living proto-dragons were far worse than he had imagined. Malygos shook his head, far too many thoughts assailing him. He was still a proto-dragon, no matter how clever he had always regarded himself to be. That he believed Alexstrasza would have been just as pressed by all these concerns did not make Malygos feel any better. Kalik, with so much going on in the present, but now trapped in this vision of the past, could again easily sympathize. A low, barely audible hiss from the southern end of the canyon drew Malygos' attention. It was so short that neither the proto-dragon nor Kalik was certain that they heard it, and Kalik, at least, knew they both had. Keeping low, Malygos cautiously crawled south. His eyes darted to every shadow, observed every large shape, be it the remnants of an animated corpse or what simply proved to be a rock. He listened carefully for a repeat of the hiss, but heard only the wind coursing through the canyon. A sound both knew was not the same one heard earlier. Possible answers ran through the proto-dragon's mind as he moved. A not living that had managed to hide from the hunters? But these corpses did not hide. They only knew their relentless hunger and thus ever searched for prey. They did not run away from it. Another potential source for the sound was an injured member amongst the attackers. This made more sense, but why had no one noticed the wounded fighter missing? Kalik watched with Malygos, but saw nothing. He questioned the wisdom of the proto-dragon's determination to find the noise, but there was no stopping Malygos. Shadows filled the area ahead. Malygos paused, then plunged into the darkness. His eyes began to adjust to the change in lighting. Something touched Malygos on the back. The proto-dragon's head twisted around. Both he and Kalik caught sight of a smaller, floating figure. Malygos hissed as his head suddenly pounded. For Kalik, though, it was as if all the thunder that had ever raged over Azeroth gathered for one fantastic storm. Had he paws of his own, Kalik would have clamped them against his ears. As it was, he could only roar as the pounding rose beyond bearing. And for once, Kalik was grateful when darkness finally claimed him. All right. All right. We covered quite a bit of story here. Whew. That was a lot of reading. I need horse. I have no idea why that reaction down there. They say nothing and then put up that icon and that's it. I have no idea why they did that. Anyway. All right, well, we'll pick that up next Sunday. We can move on into the middle of the story where we find the 5 dragons that are going to become the aspects and where they originated from. Ugh, I'm tired. Gotta. I have a short week, but still, it seems very busy. Anyway, on to the advertising. If you enjoyed the stream, please consider following and hit that notification button. Sorry, I'm just noticing something. I get easily distracted after one. All right, if you enjoyed the stream, please consider a follow and hit that notification button. That way you know when I'm actually on. Um, we're here normally Thursday through Sunday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard, 6 p.m. Pacific. Usually playing video games, but Sunday is a special day where we actually go through some history of Warcraft. Did we get a new follower? Hang on. Of course, I couldn't hear anything. So, yep. Thank you very much. The only fluffy 787 for following. Follow their lead. Oh, look at that. Never mind. They may not be there. I just clicked on their link and it says the channel's currently unavailable due to violations. So maybe they're here, maybe they're not. Who knows? Well, thanks again anyway. Follow their lead. Anyway, don't violate Twitch's terms of service, I mean. But go ahead and give us a follow and hit that notification button. That way you know we're actually on. Again, we're on Thursday through Sunday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard, 6 p.m. Pacific. Normally playing some video games. Sundays are special days where we do some story time reading, where we go into more history of Warcraft. And right now we're reading Dawn of the Aspects. And since Dragonflight is also ending, we get to read some of the background history of the dragons themselves. In case Twitch does not notify you that I'm going to be on, or in case of anything where I can't make it, I'm out of town. I'm sick. Whatever. I'm going to be late. Join us on Discord. There's a link below. Also, ! Discord, where you get to get our notifications there. Schedules will also be posted up in there, and we also have more chat rooms and stuff where we hopefully we'll talk about other nerdy kind of things in there. We have a Facebook page, not as active on there as we are anywhere else. Discord's your best bet to keep in touch with everybody. We have a YouTube page, link below, ! YouTube. Right now the VODs are being put up in there when I get the chance to. Also, there's going to be other series that I'm going to be working on in the meantime once I get enough time to do it. We are working toward affiliate. More eyes on me when I'm live on Twitch, the better. So share with your friends if anyone wants to get more of a lore deep dive while playing Warcraft. This is the place to be. I keep up with all the latest news, and I come up with my own theories, and damn if I'm not right most of the time. I won't say I'm right every single time, but I'm right most of the time. So if you want somebody who can actually predict what's going to happen and have somebody to go over it with you, why? I am the person to go to. I think that's about it here. Since I have a long weekend this week, because Merca, birthday in Merca, I might have like one extra stream going on. I will have it posted up in Discord of when that's actually, if and when that actually happens. Let's put it that way. Um, but we'll be back on again definitely on Thursday night at 9. We're continuing on through Burning Crusade and going through the history there. We're trying to play that out as fully as we can. Um, I just switched what server the character I'm working on is on. So there's going to be a lot more people, so we'll be able to queue up better for like dungeons and raids and such like that, so you can see that. All right, I am about to head to bed. So everybody, thank you for joining me for these past 4 nights. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a good week. Um, Happy Canada Day, if there's any Canadians on. My other country. I mean, a lot of people consider me actually Canadian because I got such a accent from living near the border before. uh, but yeah, that's about it. Have a good week. We'll see you soon, and take care.